money coming from him. He had no knowledge. And I know for sure that if he had knowledge, he wouldn't have accepted it. He accepted it because it was a loan by the Abu Dhabi family to him, especially from the Crown Prince.
What would you say to people who say they don't believe that you're covering it up?
No, I mean, in all honesty, that's the truth. I mean, I cannot. There's nothing I can do if people don't believe it. But that's the honest truth, because my track record as Prime Minister, I can stand by it, because this country has developed by leaps and bounds during my tenure.
Just going back to when the police raided...
Can we... we're supposed to talk about the economy.
We are going to, but there's just a couple of more...
You're talking too much about this.
But listen, there are just a couple of other allegations that I do need to...
No, I don't want to talk too much about it. I cannot talk.
Well, I tell you, I do want to ask you about your decision. You have recently called for the reinvestigation of several high-profile murders to be reinvestigated. That people say that you're...
Okay, right. Yeah. You can ask me that.
That you're linked.
I know you're very fond of this subject. I know that.
Yes. Well, you've recently called for the reinvestigation of several high-profile murders that many say you are linked to. The murder of Alton Tuya Sharibu in 2006, Hussein Najadi in 2013, and Kevin Moraes in 2015. Why didn't you reopen those cases when you were Prime Minister?
Put it this way, it went through the courts. In the case of Alton Tuya, went through the court at the highest level, the federal court. So I have been cleared entirely by this legal process, and if you ask the then Chief Police of Malaysia, he will testify, he will verify that I had no involvement whatsoever.
I was deported from Malaysia in June 2015 while filming a story about the murder of Alton Tuya Sharibu. Why did you have me deported from this country?
We deported you. You're a nuisance. Because as far as I'm concerned, making lies, fabricating lies, is not something that we want to tolerate in this country.
But I wasn't fabricating lies. I was actually seeking an interview with you. I have no political agenda in this country. I was just trying to understand what the truth was.
The way you've been asking is as though in your mind I was already involved.
Not at all. I was saying to you,
nothing to do with Alton Tuya. Nothing.
So just because I was filming a story about Alton Tuya's murder in this country, that was the reason to deport me. That was decided
by the authorities. They don't want things to be stirred up in this country. I leave it to them.
We understand that that directive came directly from the Prime Minister's office, your office.
Well, I'm not party to the decision, but as far as I'm concerned, I am totally innocent of the Alton Tuya case. Absolutely.
The 1MDB
scandal... Can we go to the economy, please?
Well,
look, you've spent so much of this time. Otherwise, I'm going to walk out.
Okay, just one thing.
No more, please.
Many people say...
No more, all right.
Okay.
That's it. I'm
done.
Okay. If you want to talk about economy, I'll sit down.
Well, we can talk about...
Come on, you're not being fair to me. If you want to ask about the economy, what I did...
you are facing serious charges in this country, and people...
Look, I've done my part.
No,
I'm not going to stand anymore for this. If you want to ask about the economy, I'll talk to you.
Okay, we'll ask about... Let's talk, given what's happened to you, let's talk about your legacy.
Okay, we'll talk about the legacy. I'm fine.
That's the last question.
We'll talk about the legacy.
Yeah. What do you consider to be your legacy as Prime Minister of Malaysia?
I have steered the progress of this country. I'm very proud of my achievement, my government's achievement. First of all, in terms of the stewardship of the economy. For 6 years, we exceeded the growth of the 4 so-called Asian tigers: Korea, Taiwan, Japan, and Singapore. I'm proud of the achievements that I've achieved.
How do you feel about the fact that the 1MDB scandal has stained that legacy to a certain extent?
I regret, And I wish there was no 1MDB issue whatsoever.
Jolo.
Thank you.
Oh, no. Can I just ask you about Jolo? Because it is important. No.
It's enough.
It is. Why do you think he... No. Why? No. Just you... He's... But Mr. Najib, it is important because people are asking... He has been charged with money laundering and he's evading arrest. You're facing arrest. He's not. I think it's really important that you talk about how you feel about that.
No, I mean, let them take action against Joe Low. I mean, I'm not in the government now. Let the government pursue him. That's as I'm concerned.
Yeah, but why do you think he is evading arrest? He hasn't spoken out in support of you.
I am not in touch with him anymore.
But he hasn't spoken out in support of you.
Please follow him. Please follow up with him.
You want us to follow up with him?
Well, do whatever you need to do.
Do you blame him for any of this?
Look, as I said, my position is clear.
I don't know if still going to court, so I think it's better.
Let the process with law take its course.
I think
let it take its course.
When was the last time you communicated?
Okay,
thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Najib.
80% of the visually impaired could be cured with access to treatment. And where there is a will, there is a way. A flying, state-of-the-art hospital.
Wow.
Covering over 77 countries.
How many of these patients will be seen today?
Everywhere. And in Pakistan, one man's passion provides free treatment for over 1 million patients a year. The Cure Revisited on Al Jazeera.
November on Al Jazeera.
Radicalized Youth, a new hard-hitting series, comes face-to-face with the hatred and violence of militant groups that attract young people around the world.
On November 5th, the US will impose additional sanctions on Iran, targeting the oil sector. We'll look at the impact that may have.
When migrant lives are in danger at sea, who should come to their aid? People in Power investigates.
The United States is getting ready for the US midterm elections on November 6th. Join us for live coverage and analysis.
And the Listening Post continues to examine global media coverage and look behind the headlines.
November on Al Jazeera.
Saudi Arabia's chief prosecutor goes into a second round of talks with Turkish officials about the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi.
Where is his body?
As Khashoggi's fiancée points the finger of blame at Saudi Arabia's rulers demanding the opportunity for a proper burial. Hello there, I'm Laura Kyle. This is Al Jazeera Live from Doha. Also coming up, more remains are recovered from a crashed Indonesian airliner as investigators scour the sea for clues about what brought it down. US beefs up its border forces with another 5,000 troops in a show of force against refugees and migrants making their way from Central America. And we'll look at the threat facing a unique Australian creature as a global report sounds the alarm about wildlife. Saudi Arabia's chief prosecutor has gone into another meeting with Turkish officials in Istanbul to discuss the killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. It follows their talks on Monday, which left the Turkish prosecutor's office unsatisfied. Neither side handed over their evidence. Meanwhile, Jamal Khashoggi's fiancée has told an audience in London that she holds Saudi's rulers responsible for what happened. Hatice Cengiz is calling on anyone involved to reveal where his body is and has urged world leaders to increase pressure on the kingdom.
I am deeply grateful for the solidarity of people all over the world. I am, however, disappointed in the actions of the leadership in many countries, particularly in the US. President Trump reveal the truth and ensure justice be served. He should not pave the way for a cover-up of my fiancé's murder. Let's not let money taint our conscience and compromise our values.
Well, Alan Fisher joins us live now from the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. And Alan, first of all, what more do we know about this second round of talks between the Saudi and Turkish prosecutors?
Well, we know that that meeting is broken up just in the last 5-10 minutes or so, and the reason you're seeing so many photographers behind me rather than the shot of the front door of the consulate that you normally see is there is speculation that the prosecutor from Saudi Arabia is actually on his way here. Now, if that's the case, he could be here in the next few minutes, and if we get any more update, we will let you know. We've also found out from sources telling Al Jazeera that the prosecutor from Saudi Arabia handed over the 18 statements from the people that they are currently holding in Saudi Arabia in connection with the death of Jamal Khashoggi. Now, there was an impasse after the meeting yesterday. The Turks had asked for that. Saudis, it certainly didn't help. The Turks made the point that the Saudis had promised a complete and open and transparent investigation, and so clearly the chief prosecutor has gone away. He's had discussions with people on the phone with people in Riyadh, and the decision has been made to hand over the documents to the Turkish side. Now, there was also a problem for the Saudis. They were insisting that the Turks, if they had any audio or videotapes, then they should be provided to the Saudis. The Turks weren't keen on doing that. They said until there was a full indictment prepared against those 18 people, that was not something they were ready to do. It also leaks into the area of intelligence gathering, and so there might have been a reluctance on the Turkish side to do that. But just to recap, in the last couple of minutes we've found out that the Saudis have actually provided the documentation, the statements of the 18 people that are currently being held in Saudi Arabia in connection with the death of Jamal Khashoggi to the prosecutors here in Istanbul. The prosecutors are insisting that they want to see those 18 extradited. That has been ruled out by the Saudi Foreign Minister. The other difficulty with that, of course, is the fact that Saudi Arabia and Turkey do not have an extradition treaty, so there would need to be some sort of special arrangement to allow that to happen. At the moment, it seems the Saudis just simply aren't interested in doing that.
OK, and Alan, meanwhile, we've got the Turks continuing to compile evidence. What new angles are we hearing about in the investigation?
Well, they're pushing very hard on two fronts. First of all, they want to find out what happened to Jamal Khashoggi's body. Are they looking for a body? Are they looking for body parts? Because we know he's definitely dead. The other thing, they want to know this local cooperator, as the Saudis call him. Who was he? Does he actually exist? He was the man that the Saudis said was given the task of disposing of the body. Now, while the Saudis argue that what happened inside the consulate is under international law, Saudi soil, and therefore it's up to them to deal with it, the Turks are making the point that anyone who committed an offence in Turkey, particularly if they're a Turkey national, and disposing of a body would meet that criteria, then they're fully entitled to that name. A couple of other things they're looking at. They've examined the drains, the sewers near the Consulate General's accommodation not far from here. They did that with cameras. This was after the local municipality cleared that area as a matter of routine just last week. They say they're going to look at what they've found and they'll make an analysis of that. The other thing they're looking at too is the fact that the fireplace in the Consul General's house, well, it had been used recently and then was spotlessly clean. How do they know how well it had been cleaned? Because they couldn't find the fingerprint of the Consul General anywhere in that room, and to them that is obviously very suspicious. Now, these might seem very small, unrelated items, but what the prosecutors, what the investigators are trying to do is to build a picture that will give them a complete idea of what exactly happened. Now, just as I come to the end of that, if you take a look over my shoulder, you'll see these two cars arriving, and maybe just through the gap you can see the gentleman that we believe is the chief Saudi prosecutor, and indeed it is. He is now arriving here at the consulate. Obviously this will be part of his investigation. We've heard from people inside the consulate. They have provided statements. We heard that 18 statements have now been handed over to the Turkish side, and the chief prosecutor, who's expected to leave back for Saudi Arabia at some point later on Tuesday, is now inside the consulate. The door is closed and he will be in there presumably to speak to local staff, people who were around at the time, and also just to see this scene where Jamal Khashoggi was killed by the Saudis almost a month ago.
Indeed. OK, Alan, that was good timing, getting the Saudi prosecutor arriving there at the consulate. For the moment, we'll leave it and we'll come back to you as and when we get new lines from the Saudis and the Turks. Thanks very much. Now, it's been revealed that the Indonesian airline which crashed on Monday had technical problems the day before, and its pilots reported more problems just before the Boeing 737 went down, with 189 passengers and crew on board. Deep-sea divers are searching for the black box recorders of the Lion Air flight. It's the low-cost airline's 11th major accident in 16 years. Wayne Hay reports from Jakarta.
Piece by piece, search and rescue teams bring back what they've found floating on the Java Sea. ID cards, passports and other personal items belonging to some of the 189 people on board are being sorted. Body parts are being taken to a nearby hospital where relatives have the harrowing task of making identifications.
Our family is still hoping she survives. We still have a big hope for that. But if she did not survive, we pray that her remains can quickly be discovered so we can take her home to be buried.
Finding out what happened in the final moments of Lion Air Flight 610 and why it crashed into the sea soon after takeoff is likely to take a long time.
My father was on board, but we still don't know. We are still hoping for the best because there hasn't been an official statement from Lion Air. So we are still hoping for the best.
But increasingly, speculation is turning to a problem with the instruments in the cockpit, giving false readings. Lion Air has confirmed there was a technical problem with the plane before it took off from Bali to Jakarta on Sunday. It says the issue was fixed, but during that flight, the pilot reported problems with the flight control system. And satellite data collected by independent flight monitoring websites shows unusual fluctuations in speed and altitude soon after it took off from Bali. The situation stabilised and Lion Air says the problem was fixed again when it landed in Jakarta and it was cleared to take off on Monday morning. It crashed some 12 minutes after it left the Indonesian capital. Small pieces of debris are being found, but the search for the main wreckage continues. On the Java Sea, more than 800 people are involved in the search for debris, bodies and clues to what happened to Lion Air Flight 610. Wayne Hay, Al Jazeera, Jakarta.
The US government is sending more than 5,000 troops to its southern border in a show of force as groups of refugees and migrants make their way north from Central America. President Donald Trump has described the so-called migrant caravans as an invasion. Mike Hanna reports from Washington, D.C.
This is what's described as a readiness exercise. Customs and Border Protection officers deployed in full riot gear at the US-Mexico border. A short distance away, hundreds of people lined up to wait for a chance to request asylum in the United States. But with thousands more migrants on their way, the Trump administration has decided to deploy soldiers in support. 5,200, the initial number.
On the border, we are preparing what we call defense support for civilian authorities. Right now, it'll be phased. Right now, if you look at how we organize for the storms for Puerto Rico, where you surround the storms, for Texas, for Florida, we surround the storm.
And an insistence from the theater commander that the operation is constitutional and not in breach of posse comitatus, the Civil War-era law that prohibits the offensive deployment of troops on U.S. soil.
With respect to posse comitatus, everything that we are doing is in line with and adherence to posse comitatus.
The one exception that allows troops to be deployed offensively is an invasion, a spectre invoked by President Trump in a threatening tweet, saying, without providing any evidence, "Many gang members and some very bad people are mixed into the caravan heading to our southern border. Please go back. You will not be admitted into the United States unless you go through the legal process." He concludes, "This is an invasion of our country and our military is waiting for you." U.S. administration officials point to the violence that broke out at Guatemala's border with Mexico as hundreds tried to force their way across to join the large group of would-be immigrants to the U.S. already on their way. The main body of people, now numbering some 3,500, is still hundreds of kilometers away from the US border and could take weeks to arrive. The timing of the deployment more likely determined by next week's midterm elections, in which President Trump has explicitly said the issue of immigration should play a dominant role. Mike Hanna, Al Jazeera, Washington.
We've got the weather next for you, and then he gave people a say, but hardly anyone voted. Critics blast Mexico's president-elect for scrapping a new airport. And Jewish leaders tell Donald Trump he's not welcome in Pittsburgh as they prepare to bury victims of Saturday's synagogue shooting.
Hello. The eye of the typhoon has gone through the northern Philippines now. It's at the top of your screen there. But of course, as is always the case, it takes much of the energy from the rest of the weather system. So there's a trail of showers running through northern Borneo and back towards peninsular Malaysia and southern Thailand. But beyond that, not much. In the forecast, that line is very obvious. So the potential for heavy rain still exists for Kuala Lumpur, Singapore, and down through most of Sumatra, even as far as western Java, with a shower or two in Borneo. As for the Philippines, the showers will still be there as legacy, well, rain really, and thunderstorms for Luzon as the typhoon disappears. Otherwise, it's a dryish situation. Nothing much changes by the time we get to Thursday either. Same sort of areas are likely to get wet. In Australia, we've had the latest little system running through Tasmania, as you can see. Now, it's been a very active spring so far, and the potential for showers developing as the warmth slowly comes up is still there. So for southern Queensland, that potential exists. 23 in Melbourne in the sunshine. Tasmania is fine once more. And Perth, the cloud is back with you, the tail end of a frontal system. So you've got about 19 or 20 degrees. Any rain from that? Well, it's likely to be, I think, mostly slight. For South Island and New Zealand, there is more rain on the way. For the north, it's sunny.
Mi hijo Cristian Rodríguez de Lumbre está haciendo falta y que no se sienta solo.
1236 shots fired, officer involved. Her son was shot 14 times, mine was shot 7.
Short documentaries from around the world about those who won't give up their fight for justice. Al Jazeera selects Justice.
Again, you're watching Al Jazeera. Here's a reminder of our top stories this hour. Turkish investigators looking into the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi have been meeting Saudi Arabia's top prosecutor for the second time. Sources have told Al Jazeera that the Saudi side has handed over testimonies of 18 suspects being held in the kingdom. They'd refused to do so in Monday's talks. There are still, however, disagreements over where the suspects should be tried. Indonesian divers are scouring the ocean floor for the black box flight recorders from a passenger plane that crashed on Monday with 189 people on board. The Lion Air Boeing 737 MAX plunged into the sea just minutes after taking off from Jakarta. And the US government is sending more than 5,000 troops to the Mexican border in a show of force as groups of refugees and migrants make their way north from Central America. Now, the race is on for the top job in Europe's biggest economy after German Chancellor Angela Merkel announced she will leave politics at the end of her term in 2021. She's also stepping down as leader of her party, a position she's held for nearly 2 decades after the Christian Democrats suffered big losses in regional elections. Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, dubbed Mini Merkel, is the favourite to replace her. Health Minister Jens Spahn has also put up his hand. Well, Nadim Barber joins us live now from Berlin. So, Nadim, tell us a little bit about who is poised to replace Merkel.
Well, those figures you were mentioning just then are very different kinds of people within Angela Merkel's CDU party. As you were saying, a lot of people consider Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer as Chancellor Merkel's preferred successor to take on the leadership of the party. She was previously the leader of a small southwestern region in Germany where she earned the reputation as a centrist. She has shown herself to be liberal on immigration policy, and she's formed a coalition previously, including the Greens. And so some people, as you were saying, see her as a mini Merkel, somebody who will continue in that line of centrist policies here in Germany, contrasted with Jens Spahn, who has been outspoken in criticising what he sees as the effects of the open immigration policy. He has criticised, for example, what he sees as prejudice amongst some immigrant populations. And so there is talk that he would be the figure, if it were him to take over the leadership, which would actually see the party take a more nationalist line. Whether that would see them drift towards working with the far-right Alternative for Germany party, which has been on the rise, that's another question, but it's a fear that's been raised among some people here in Germany right now.
That's a pretty major announcement, isn't it, Nadim? What reaction have we seen to it, both in Germany and from Europe?
Well, there hasn't been that much surprise here in Germany that she will not seek re-election in 2021, but she's stepping down as party leader by the end of the year, and so there has been a lot of speculation as to what's caused this. The CDU has seen a succession of bad electoral performances just this weekend in the region of Hesse. It's been losing votes, but so too has its Social Democrat Party partners who they govern with nationally. They've been losing votes as well. So this governing coalition here in Germany, the Grand Coalition, is seen to be very rocky. Lots of speculation that it could crumble before 2021, and now people are asked, she will turn to the right, perhaps listen to the populists that have sprung up in other countries a bit more, or whether they will actually continue to push back. So lots of speculation here and in Europe.
Nadim Barber in Berlin. Thanks very much, Nadim. Now, Donald Trump is due to visit Pittsburgh later on Tuesday as the first funerals are held for 11 people killed during a shooting in a synagogue there. But members of the Jewish community have written an open letter to Trump saying he's not welcome unless he fully denounces white nationalism. Andy Gallagher reports from Pittsburgh.
At the Tree of Life Synagogue in Squirrel Hill, people from across the city continue to lay tributes for the 11 victims that were killed on Saturday morning. The Attorney General called the shooting an attack on all people of faith. One survivor described the moments after the first shots rang out.
I tried to see if I could go back to get the 8 remaining people who were in the back of the congregation, but I could tell gunfire was getting louder, it was coming up the stairs, and I couldn't save those 8 people.
The suspected shooter, Robert Bowers, appeared in court on Monday. The 46-year-old faces 29 separate charges and could face the death penalty. In another development, a group of Jewish leaders has published an open letter to President Trump telling him he should stay away. One excerpt reads, "President Trump, you are not welcome in Pittsburgh until you fully denounce white nationalism." The president is due in Pittsburgh on Tuesday.
We have no use for him. He's calling himself a nationalist. The last political group that I heard of that called themselves nationalists were Nazis.
At a White House briefing, the president's press secretary told reporters Donald Trump has made his feelings on hate crimes clear.
The president has denounced racism, hatred, and bigotry in all forms on a number of occasions. We'll continue to do that. I'm doing it here today. And I would also say at the same time that some individuals, they're grieving, they're hurting. The president wants to be there to show the support of this administration for the Jewish community. The rabbi said that he is welcome as well.
As this community continues to mourn the 11 people that were killed on Saturday morning, the first funerals are due to take place on Tuesday. 2 brothers who were killed in what's described as the worst attack on the Jewish community in US history will take place. Meanwhile, the phrase "hate has no home here" is springing up all across this city. Andy Gallagher, Al Jazeera, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
There's been another setback for Bangladesh's opposition leader in her plans to run in December's elections. Khaleda Zia's jail term for corruption has been doubled from 5 to 10 years. She was initially sentenced in February on charges of stealing money from an orphanage when she was last in power. She was separately convicted on Monday of misappropriating more than $300,000 from a charity. Zia says all the charges are part of efforts to keep her out of politics. Protesters have gathered outside the official residence of ousted Sri Lankan Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe, who's refusing to leave. President Maithripala Sirisena is coming under increasing pressure to uphold the constitution and reconvene parliament after he replaced Wickremesinghe with former President Mahinda Rajapaksa. Bernard Smith has more from Colombo.
Sri Lanka's President Maithripala Sirisena is resisting calls from these people and the Speaker of the country's parliament to reconvene parliament so that it can vote on whether the man holed up in that building behind me, the Prime Minister's official residence, is in fact still Prime Minister. Ranil Wickremesinghe was fired on Friday by the President and replaced by former President Mahinda Rajapaksa. But everybody here is saying this is all unconstitutional.
I think everyone is really surprised about what happened and everyone's really shocked, but everyone kind of feels like they need to figure out how we can stop this because we can't let this happen, not on our watch.
We are hoping that a protest of this nature by citizens, by the people of Sri Lanka who have a right for the government to follow the democratic process.
Now, the President says that he is respecting the Constitution, but it was changed a couple of years ago, taking powers away from the presidency and giving further powers to parliamentarians, to Parliament, making sure that Parliament is responsible for who is the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister has to command a majority in Parliament. So the fear amongst the protesters here is that if the President gets away with changing Prime Minister, then the advances that have been made in Sri Lanka's democracy are at risk.
Now, we've been given another snapshot of our impact on the planet, and it's alarming. Conservation group the Worldwide Fund for Nature says humans have brought about cataclysmic destruction to Earth's biodiversity. It says populations of mammals, birds, fish, reptiles and amphibians declined by 60% between 1970 and 2014. The biggest losses of almost 90% were seen in Central and South America. The organisation says humans are squarely to blame, with habitat destruction, overfishing and overhunting all having an impact. And all of this isn't just having an environmental effect. The WWF highlights how nature provides goods and services worth around $125 trillion a year. Australia's east coast has become a global deforestation hotspot. WWF says that part of the world is likely to lose 3 million hectares of trees in the next 15 years, eroding animal habitats such as koalas. Andrew Thomas reports from Port Stephens.
They are one of two animals Australia is known for. But unlike kangaroos, koala numbers are falling fast. Cars kill them, as do dogs and disease. But the central cause, one that lies behind all those threats, is human destruction of the places koalas live, forcing them closer to people and each other.
It all comes back to habitat loss. If a koala has lost habitat, they have to come down, search for habitat, which then makes them have to cross roads, so they're susceptible to being hit by cars and attacked by dogs as well.
North of Sydney, this small rehabilitation centre is about to be transformed into a full koala hospital, costing $2 million. The state government of New South Wales will pay for it, but that's the same government, say campaigners, which is allowing, even encouraging, the destruction of koala habitat.
We are incredibly appreciative that we're getting this hospital. We need this hospital, but the laws that allow the habitat clearing, it's give on one hand and take on the other.
Last year, New South Wales relaxed laws controlling the amount of land farmers can clear of trees. As a result, says a new report, land clearing rates have tripled. Those behind the report say that if current trends continue, koalas could be extinct in the wild in New South Wales by 2050.
It's really shocking, and it's certainly within our power to stop. But if we don't stop habitat destruction, we will be the ones that will see these animals in the wild for the last time.
New South Wales' Environment Minister turned down a request for an interview, but the state government says old land clearing laws were too restrictive. Farming and development does not need to threaten koalas. But this patch of wetland forest north of Sydney illustrates the subjective nature of the decisions. It's owned by the Education Department of the state government, which doesn't need it for a school, so 2 years ago sold it to a developer. After environmentalists started petitions and campaigns, the state government said it had made a mistake and is now trying to buy the land back for more than it was sold.
One part of government doesn't communicate with the other. Before any government department flogs off land, they're supposed to go around to other government departments and ask, do you want it? Nobody asks the Department of Environment, as far as we know, do you want this land?
The more land that disappears, the more animal hospitals will be needed. Andrew Thomas, Al Jazeera, Port Stephens, Australia.
The value of the Mexican peso has suffered its biggest fall for 2 years after the president-elect cancelled construction of a new airport in the capital. Crews were told to go home by Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who says contracts for the multi-billion-dollar project are corrupt. From Mexico City, John Holman reports.
A new space-age airport meant to propel Mexico into the 21st century. Its cost, $13 billion. Its construction well underway. But on Monday, President-elect Andrés Manuel López Obrador brought it to a juddering halt. The project was riddled with corruption and cronyism, he said. Instead, other airports will have their capacities increased.
2 runways will be built in the Santa Lucia Military Airport. The current airport in Mexico City will be improved, and the Toluca Airport will be reactivated.
But the decision was about more than just the airport or the markets. For many, it was an early sign of how the president-elect plans to govern. He said he'd let the people choose the way ahead via a national referendum. But when it was finished this Sunday, it was widely panned. Just 1% of the electorate turned out.
The questions were flawed, skewed in favor of the option that the new government wants. It was shown that voters could vote more than once in the different polling stations. I mean, hardly you can see this as a successful exercise of participative democracy.
López Obrador plans to change the constitution for more referendums on key issues. But that's not the sort of decision-making that will tempt future investors, say business leaders.
We hope that the incoming government make the rules of the game clearer, so that long-term projects don't suffer from the repercussions and mistrust of the Mexican government.
At the stock exchange, those repercussions were already being felt. The drop in the peso is a real reflection of the deep concerns of the markets and the business community. But the president-elect says that he's not governing for them, he's governing for the people, and first and foremost, the poor. He says the airport project's cancellation will save the country $5 billion a year, and his alternative plan will be finished in 3 years. By that time, Mexicans will also have a clearer idea of who they voted into power. John Holman, Al Jazeera, Mexico City.
With Al Jazeera, these are our top stories. Turkish investigators looking into the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi have been meeting Saudi Arabia's top prosecutor for a second time. Sources have told Al Jazeera that the Saudi side has handed over testimonies of 18 suspects being held in the kingdom. They'd refused to do so in Monday's talks. There are still disagreements over where the suspects should be tried. Indonesian divers are scouring the ocean floor for the flight recorders from a passenger plane that crashed on Monday with 189 people on board. So far, they've recovered human remains and belongings off the coast of Java Island. The Lion Air Boeing 737 MAX, which went into service only months ago, plunged into the sea just minutes after taking off from Jakarta. The pilot radioed air traffic control, asking to turn back just before the jet went down. The US government is sending more than 5,000 troops to the Mexican border. It's a show of force as groups of refugees and migrants make their way north from Central America. 15 senior officials from Myanmar are in Bangladesh for talks on the possible return of Rohingya refugees to Rakhine State. They're now in the capital, Dhaka, and are due to visit the refugee camps in Cox's Bazar later. Last year, nearly 1 million Rohingya refugees fled what the UN calls a campaign of violence by the Myanmar military. They've since been living along Bangladesh's border. In another setback for Bangladesh's opposition leader, Khalida Zia's plans to run in December's elections, her jail term in a corruption case has been extended from 5 to 10 years. She was initially sentenced in February on charges of stealing money from an orphanage when she was last in power. She was then separately convicted on Monday of misappropriating more than $300,000. And a Japanese steel company is being ordered to compensate 4 South Koreans for their forced labour during World War II. South Korea's Supreme Court has ruled that Nippon Steel must pay each plaintiff $87,000. The company has called the ruling regrettable. Japan occupied Korea from 1910 to 1945. Those are your headlines. More news continues after AJ selects.
It's been described as the Wild West previously, where the average person couldn't actually tell if a post had been sponsored or paid for in some way.
Does this updated NAFTA have the kind of support that it needs?
We bring you the stories that are shaping the economic world we live in. Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera.
Just got a call from the Starbucks by Red Arrow Park. They say there's a homeless guy that's sleeping there if you want to check on him. He's a black male, 30 to 40 years old.
1246, shots fired, officer involved.
One person is shot and killed by Milwaukee police in the heart of downtown Milwaukee.
The chief says the suspect grabbed the officer's baton and started beating him with it.
Understand that this is the initial version of events.
Justice! Now! Justice! Now!
Today is the grand opening tea party for the mothers for the Justice Circle. So for now, I'll just put it there. I'm going to be introduced to the other mothers that are going through the same type of pain I am.
Okay, hi, sweetheart.
Right, you know.
Her son was shot 14 times, mine was shot 7. Your husband was shot 6. That's why I'm here, and I thank God that I'm here, you know.
Amen.
You know, yeah.
Dontre was my brilliant child. He never showed any signs of any kind of paranoid or schizophrenic. He was normal. He had a driver's license. He paid his own bills. We start seeing signs when he would say things like, "Did you hear that? You don't hear that?" On April 30th, Dontre went to Red Arrow Park, something that he frequently did throughout his life. He was sitting in the park, and the manager at Starbucks called the police to have Dontre removed because she thought he was a homeless man. The first call, the police officers answered her call, and they came out and they had a discussion with Dontre. And they went and told her they found that he wasn't doing anything wrong. When the call came through dispatch, it went to Christopher Manning, the beat cop.
Me and they kind of got into back and forth words to the point where the officer grabbed his baton out and struck Dontre a couple times with the baton. Dontre took the baton. And from there, you have the officer saying that Dontre struck him. You have witness saying that Dontre never hit the officer.
We were told that Christopher Manning jumped to try to retrieve the baton from Dontre, and he missed, and he pulled his gun out, and he shot my baby 14 times. I sat on the couch for 2 months, and I believe the whole 2 months I was in shock. I felt like I had nothing and I felt alone. They're saying that Dontre was homeless and he just crazy, schizophrenic, and that's why he was shot.
Thou art with me.
Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies.
Right, he said my son pushed him, now he hit him in his head. I was like, we don't know if that's true. There's only 2 people know that's true, and that one of them is dead.
Right.
He's a person. He's a person.
They're killing people that don't have weapons. All they have to say is, I feared for my life after they murder people. These are the ones that died this year. I don't want to mix up. I found out that justice wasn't served in any of these cases, and it was overwhelming. All right, thank you, sweetheart. It was good hearing from you. And I'm praying for you, and be strong. I'm the founder of Mothers for Justice United. I decided to name this march the Million Moms March, not really expecting it to get as big as it has. Let me tell you a little bit about the trip. We're leaving here. We're going to Washington, D.C. May 9th. May 9th is my birthday, and Dantre was buried on May 9th.
Maria Hamilton is the main organizer and will lead a Mother's Day march that will take place Saturday of this week, and they're going to be meeting with people in the White House. You have been incredible, calling people to accountability, organizing other mothers.
Meeting these moms and doing the research brought me to this place that I'm at.
I'm not sure if I lost a child in such a terrible, violent way, if I would have the courage or the strength.
I just want to praise you ladies for having the courage to speak up.
I also personally believe that there should be some form of a civilian panel that is involved as well.
We're headed to talk to staffers about police brutality and vigilante killings.
So nervous.
We're going to give them our demands.
We're just asking all the moms right now who have a meeting at the White House, we'd like you to come into this room.
We're ordering a national call for the DOJ to have special prosecutors, people that do not have any kind of links to the police officers or the DA's office. Hopefully we can get cases reopened and possibly get justice for their kids' life. We didn't do the script that was proposed. This is life, this is reality.
The voice that we gave today, they might have been crying, but I think they heard us though. Because everybody seemed like they just wanted to break down at any given second. And then I think once we left, I think they gonna cry.
I have post-traumatic stress disorder. I take medication to keep the flashbacks away because my son was shot and killed in my home, in my face, in front of me and my daughter.
They broke his door, they tased him, they shoot him 10 times. And I've been trying to piece together exactly what happened.
Fight back! Fight back! Fight back!
It is so many moms that didn't feel anybody cared that have joined forces with us, and it's no stopping that.
We're sitting here waiting, and while we're waiting, more babies are dying.
Because there's so much violence, and it needs to stop.
No one deserves to die the way Dantre died. I was broken until I learned how to fight. I will be back here every year to make sure that these police officers that are taking human life go to jail.
It could have been mine. I'm not your son, but Mom, happy birthday. Happy Mother's Day.
Trey was bigger than life. I hear him rapping. I see him with his gray Jordans. But what I enjoyed most is his smile. We are considering starting some Mothers for Justice chapters all over the United States. I want to have a national organization. I'm determined to get change. So Mothers for Justice gives me hope.
Fue correr lo más rápido que pude a esconderme. Ahí fue donde cae el compañero Aldo Gutiérrez. O sea, cuando empezaron a disparar, cayó, inmediatamente le pegaron un tiro en la cabeza.
Desde entonces se ha emprendido una gran lucha.
In the southern Mexican state of Guerrero, 43 students have been missing since September 26, 2014. The young men were returning from a protest in the city of Iguala when municipal police opened fire on a convoy of buses the group had commandeered. They were studying at a rural teacher training college known as Escuela Normal Rural de Ayotzinapa, which has a history of left-wing political activism.
Él se llama Saúl Bruno García. Además que, o sea, mi mejor amigo porque, pues, él dormía a un lado de mí. Yo me gusta que me digan Jul, dice, porque, pues, él tiene muchísima fuerza. Entonces, se levantaba a dos chavos así juntos y hacer ejercicio. Era muy carismático el compa, muy buena onda, entrado en el desmadre. El desmadre así un poco medio pesadito conmigo. Teníamos un chingo de planes con ese compa.
Hay a veces oigo algún ruido en la calle, pues yo me levanto pensando pues que mi hijo en cualquier momento puede llegar. Mi hijo Cristian Rodríguez de Lumbre me está haciendo falta y que no se sienta solo, que su padre, su mamá, sus hermanos lo estamos buscando.
Guerrero es uno de los países más pobres de México. Ves a las familias con sus hijos descalzos, con sus hijos sin ropa.
Hay gente que no tiene día a día para ir comiendo.
Esta escuela es la esperanza de muchas familias. Es la esperanza de muchos chavos que quieren seguir adelante, que tienen ganas de salir adelante. Y pues aquí más que nada, ahora sí que te quitan la venda de los ojos, se pudiera decir, y ves la realidad.
Las normales rurales se crearon a partir de la revolución. ¿Y cuál era el fin de esa revolución? Tierra, libertad y educación para hijos y campesinos. El gobierno, tanto federal, estatal, coludido con el municipal para desaparecer las normales rurales, porque ya no quieren educación.
Ya que contamos desgraciadamente con sistemas en donde operan policías corrompidos con la corrupción, con el narcotráfico. Nosotros no somos delincuentes, nosotros somos estudiantes que buscamos un mejor futuro.
Mexico's Attorney General says Iguala's mayor and wife were likely the masterminds behind the events. Under their orders, local police are accused of detaining the students before handing them to the Guerreros Unidos drug gang. Their disappearance has triggered a wave of demonstrations.
Como el gobierno ha estado jugando con los sentimientos de los padres y de los alumnos de Ayotzinapa, diciendo que pues en un momento están muertos nuestros compañeros, en otro momento decir que están vivos.
No les tengo confianza pues a la PGR. Nosotros como padre de familia no tenemos confianza.
La verdadera información, con argumentos, con todo, o sea, que sea verídico. La gente sabe perfectamente que si no se manifiesta hoy en día, pues el que va a seguir pues, va a ser el 44, el 45 y van a seguir más, o sea, podría hoy surgir un modelo de revolución, la revolución de conciencia.
Kadınlar öldürülmeye devam ediyor. Özgecan kardeşimizin suçu okuluna gitmek için, evine gitmek için dolmuşa binmesi miydi?
Yol açalım. Neden böyle bir şey yaptınız? Yol açalım.
Adaletin karşısına çıkıp cezalarını çeksinler fakat Allah onların analarına, babalarına da yardımcı olsun. Yani sevmekten başka bir çıkar yolumuz yok. Hep erkenden kalkardı. Çok çalışkandı, çok hırslıydı. Cevabını bilmediği bütün soruları, yani normal bir insanın aklına gelmeyen birçok sorular sorardı. Biz kimiz, nereden geldik, nereye gideceğiz, bu insanlar ne için bu kadar kötü? Eğer dünyanın psikolog olsaydı, inanıyorum ki dünyanın en iyi psikoloğu olacaktı. Ve bu vahşeti kendisine layık görenleri bile çok iyi şekilde tedavi edeceğine inanıyorum. Özgecan'ımın ruhunun ebediyete intikal etmiş olması insanların kendilerini çok ciddi anlamda sorgulamalarına sebep olmuştur. Şiddet eğiliminde olan insanların yasalar karşısında yapacaklarından dolayı bu tür vahşet olaylarının azalacağına inanıyorum. Bu sorgulamayı yaparken yasaların daha adil bir şekilde işleyeceğini düşünüyorum. Bizim için
benimseyebilmek için
Fotoğraflarımızı yerleştirdim her yere. O da daha güzel, daha çekilir bir hal almaya başladı. Birlikteyken gerçekten tüm dünyayı, tüm her şeyi unutup, herkesi ardımızda bırakıp bizim birbirimize kendi çerçevemizden, kendi gözlüklerimizle bakardık. Sanki sadece birbirimiz için var olmuş gibiydik. Tabii ilk otobüse ya da minibüse binmek çok zordu, hala zor. O yüzden ama bunu yenmeye çalışıyorum. Birazcık daha bir şeylerin düzelmesi için üstüne gitmeye çalışıyorum ve ben kadınların, kızların kendi kendilerine aslında o kalıba koyuyorlar. Kendi kendilerine onu yakıştırıyorlar. Ama onların da çevreden gördüğü o bilinçaltına ekilen tohumlar yüzünden böyle. Onları silip süpürmek lazım. Onları böyle fırlatıp atmakla her şeyi yapabilirler. O bana sadece şey derdi. Çok nadiren moralim bozulduğu zaman sen şarkı söyle. Bırak sen bunları. Sen çılgın bestoşsun. Biliyorsun. Sen hepsini bırak, her şeyi bırak, sadece şarkı söyle. Seni sevdim diye kınarlarsa beni, kılım kıpırdamaz, kılım kıpırdamaz. Ondan sonra birazcık daha koşmaya başlıyorum. O yolculuğu tamamlamak için tekrar gücüm az da olsa yerine geliyor. Daha sonra tekrar.
Özgecan Aslan nezdinde erkek şiddetiyle katledilen tüm kadınların davasıdır.
Ben öyle bir karar istiyorum ki Yüce Türk milleti adına karar verecek siz değerli üyeler tarihe geçmelisiniz. Bu mahkemede bir tarih yazılacak. Ve tarihe not düşeceksiniz. Onun için böyle bir indirim İnşallah bundan sonra Türkiye'de hiçbir yerde kullanılmayacak. Ve bu davada da kullanılmayacak. Kullanılamaz, kabul edilemez. Asla. Ne ailesi, yaşamımızı düzene sokamayacağız.
Burada olmalarını istiyoruz onların. İnsanların duygularını, o baskıyı üzerlerine hissetmelerini istiyoruz. Dizlerinin bağının çözülmesini istiyorum. 27 yıllık avukatım, ilk kez bu kadar zor bir duruşmaya girdim. Gerek onun kişiliği, ailesinin duruşuyla, öğrenci oluşuyla, bakışıyla, konuşmasıyla, o fotoğraflardaki gülüşüyle ve öldürülüş biçimiyle Türkiye'yi değil tüm dünyayı birleştirdi aslında. Ve bir sembol oldu diye düşünüyorum. Birçok yere onun ölümünden sonra Özgecan Arslan ismi verildi.
Yazdığım opera Özge'nin doğumundan öncesini, doğumundan sonrasını anlatıyor.
Ses birinci bas. Birinci bas ses. Karanlıklar
biraz
aydınlığa
daha
kavuşsun.
başlasa olur mu acaba baba? Diyelim ki böyle lirik bir soprano başlasa olur mu? Hani daha böyle yumuşak bir sesle, hani sanki hani mesela daha böyle bunları daha meleksi bir hal. Özge'nin öyle bir sesi var
Onlar
ya.
tabii o sahneye göre, sahnedeki ışığa göre, dekora göre.
hedeflerini, amaçlarını, tüm dünyayı iyileştirme niyetinin aslında bu operayla belki de ölümsüzleşeceğini inşallah gerçekleştireceğiz.
Stories of life and inspiration. A series of short documentaries from around the world that celebrate the human spirit against the odds. Al Jazeera selects Express Yourself. A journey of personal discovery.
My great-grandfather, he was a slave of the Lee property.
Al Jazeera's James Gannon explores his family's legacy of slave ownership.
You know, like my family's, status and wealth has benefited from their choice to enslave people.
And America's debt to black people today.
Some of us so scarred, we even scared to speak out, because it's a pride thing.
Al Jazeera correspondent, A Moral Debt.
This is Al Jazeera.
Hello, I'm Sahil Rahman. You're watching the Al Jazeera News Hour live from our headquarters here in Doha. Coming up in the next 60 minutes, Saudi Arabia's chief prosecutor arrives at the consulate in Istanbul after handing over the testimonies of suspects in the Jamal Khashoggi case.
I want to bury the body of the beloved Jamal.
A plea from Khashoggi's fiancée as she urges world leaders to put pressure on Saudi Arabia. Also, more remains are recovered from a crashed Indonesian airliner as investigators scour the sea for clues about what brought it down. And life's not looking so cosy for Australia's koalas as a global report sounds a wildlife warning.
And I'm Sana Hamush with sport. We'll see what's next for Real Madrid after they sack their coach, Julian Lopetegui, just 3 months into the job.
Welcome to the News Hour. A significant development in the past hour in the investigation into the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Saudi Arabia's top prosecutor has met Turkish officials for a second time, and sources tell Al Jazeera that the testimonies of 18 suspects have now been handed over. The Saudi side had refused to do so in the first round of talks on Monday. There are still disagreements over where the suspects should be tried. Let's get the very latest from Alan Fisher, who's live for us in Istanbul. I mean, initially there was not so much cooperation from either side, despite the fact of this second round of talks. Is there really a momentous change in this dynamic at the moment?
Well, there's certainly been movement in the last couple of hours. I can tell you that behind me, the reason you're seeing all these photographers is that the chief prosecutor from Saudi Arabia is currently inside the consulate. He arrived when we were live on air about an hour ago. We're expecting him to leave at any point. A number of cars have been moved and some of his security detail have come back onto the street. So if that happens, we'll bring it to you live here on Al Jazeera. As far as the earlier meeting between the chief prosecutor of Istanbul and the chief prosecutor of Saudi Arabia, there was an impasse there on Monday. The Turks had said we want the depositions, the statements that were made by the 18 people who are currently being held in Saudi Arabia in connection with the death of Jamal Khashoggi. The Saudis point blank refused. That infuriated the Turks more than just angered them. They were very angry indeed, and that's because they say if Saudi Arabia is saying this is going to be an open and transparent investigation, then at the very least those statements should be handed over. There was a second meeting. We understand that the Saudi prosecutor consulted with some senior figures in the government in Riyadh, and those statements were handed over in the last couple of hours. Now they're in Arabic. The Turks will have to translate them and then go through them individually, but it may well give them a better idea of what happened inside the consulate, even though we are led to believe that they have audio and video from inside there. The key questions that the Saudis have to answer for the Turks is, first of all, what happened to the body? Where is Jamal Khashoggi? We know that one of the alleged hit team that arrived was carrying a bone saw. Are they looking for a body or are they looking for body parts? And who is this Turkish collaborator, the person that helped, according to the Saudis, dispose of the body? Was this an organisation? Was it an individual? Did he even exist? And while the Saudis are saying they won't extradite the 18 people, despite pleas from the Turks, because under international law the consulate is Saudi soil, therefore anything that happened there comes under their purview, the Turks are saying if there was a local that was involved in disposing of the body, that is a crime in Turkey, and therefore at the very least the Saudis should be providing that name, and they should then be allowed to interview that person. But certainly things were at an impasse on Monday. The situation has improved. The Turks still not handing over the audio and video, even though they've been asked for that by the Saudis. Their argument is that once they compile a full indictment against anyone who's involved in this killing, then that may become clearer. The other problem with that, of course, is that may well reveal how Turkish intelligence service is going about gathering materials. So we may never actually see that hitting the public domain, although we're told it exists. But certainly big developments in the last couple of hours.
Certainly, with reports of sort of new angles to the investigation, the pressure is really on the Saudis, because the one tactic that the Turks have been using is this slow drip feeding of leaked information to the media and to the wider international community.
Exactly right, and although these new angles of the investigation may provide new evidence, they might not, but it could all be linked one way or another. The thing they're looking at, we're told, is that they have sent cameras down into the sewers near the Consul General's residence, which isn't far from here. It's a short walk. It would take me less than 5 minutes to get there, and we know that the local municipality actually cleaned out the drains there last week. Now that looked suspicious, because the routine now does look suspicious here, but the municipality said, no, look, this was all part of a routine. It's things that we do anyway. This street was due. Turkish police still sent down the cameras. They say they're going to analyse the results. Second thing is that at the Consul General's residence, they looked at the fireplace there and realised that a big fire had been set in the last few days, but it had been cleaned up totally. And how did they know it had been cleaned up totally? Because in that room, they couldn't even find a fingerprint belonging to the Consul General, which immediately raised their suspicions. Now, they've taken some samples of the soot in the chimney. That may well provide them with some more information. These little things may seem unrelated, but it's all about building a much bigger picture. We think that the Turks have got a very good idea of what happened inside the consulate behind me. What they want to know is what happened to the body. They'd like to be able to find that and give it a decent burial. They think that the Saudis have that answer, and they're not fully cooperating with the Turks. So that continues to be an area where there is friction between the two sides, but certainly a bit of movement in the last couple of hours. And as I say, we're live here outside the consulate, and the chief prosecutor is still in there. We're expecting him to leave. Presumably he's in there talking to local staff, talking to people who may have been in the building at the time, people who were given the day off, as we know that happened as well, and also just taking a look at the rooms where Jamal Khashoggi was actually killed.
For the moment, we'll leave it there, Alan, and of course come back to you as that situation develops. Let's also bring our viewers up to speed with a new line that's coming from Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Says the game is being played over the Khashoggi killing to save someone. Well, Khashoggi's fiancée is in no doubt that Saudi Arabia is responsible for his murder. At a memorial in London, she's demanded they return his body. Joan Hull has more from the British capital.
This was a memorial event recalling, in the words of the director of Middle East Monitor, Dr. Dawood Abdullah, the values that Jamal Khashoggi stood for: justice, freedom of the press, political accountabilities, values that he said were universal, resonating everywhere. It was also an event that saw perhaps the most public comments yet by Khashoggi's fiancée, Khadija Cengiz.
If only I knew that there were bloodthirsty, evil people waiting inside the consulate for my Jamal, I would have done all I could to prevent him from entering.
Ve sadece bilebilseydim içeride bir ölüm mangasının beklediğini.
If only I knew that a death squad was inside. Yet we never imagined such a level of barbarity, cruelty and evil could be waiting for Jamal.
Miss Cengiz described Khashoggi as a journalist and an intellectual whose words frightened unjust and greedy autocrats. She called on the Saudi authorities to reveal the whereabouts of his remains to allow a dignified burial.
Cemal bizim dünyamızda demokrasi,
He is a martyr for the struggle for democracy and freedom in our part of the world. I want to bury the body of the beloved Jamal. Therefore, I'm asking once again, where is his body?
And then there was this powerful political appeal to world leaders, taking particular aim at US President Donald Trump, whose invitation to visit the White House she has turned down.
I am, however, disappointed in the actions of the leadership in many countries, particularly in the US. President Trump should help reveal the truth and ensure justice be served. He should not pave the way for a cover-up of my fiancé's murder. Let's not let money taint our conscience and compromise our values.
A mix of emotion and grief, protest and politics, recalling a man and a journalist killed, apparently, for speaking his mind. Jonah Hull, Al Jazeera, Central London.
And the White House says US President Donald Trump is still considering action against Saudi Arabia for the killing of Khashoggi. White House correspondent Kimberly Halkett has more on the story.
We haven't heard much since we know that the CIA director, Gina Haspel, went to Turkey. And she went there because the president asked for audio and video intelligence, which was not supplied. So we were trying to get some answers about whether or not Gina Haspel had actually heard the audio that is rumored to have been released. And in fact, details the not only interrogation of Jamal Khashoggi, but also his murder. When asked about this, Sarah Sanders had this to say.
The president met last week with CIA Director Gina Haspel after having gathered additional intelligence on her overseas trip, and the administration is weighing different options and will make an announcement about what the decision of that action is.
Now, the president did promise when this story first developed severe punishment for even the highest levels of the Saudi government if, in fact, it was discovered there have been lies and deception, which certainly the president has acknowledged he believes there has been. But so far, he has defended the denials of not only the crown prince, but also the king, that they had any understanding of what happened with regard to this, that they did not in any way order the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. But certainly the White House is, as you heard there from Sarah Sanders, weighing its options. They are not ruling out taking action against Saudi Arabia. But again, we should note, with just 8 days until a U.S. election, the president, it appears, has decided that there is no electoral advantage to talking about this story. And it appears he is waiting until after the vote, given the controversial nature of this story and the fact that it could play into the minds of the voters when they make their decision when it's time to go to the polls.
Let's go straight back to Turkey and to Istanbul, straight back to Alan Fisher. New news lines coming out from the wire, certainly, that the Turkish prosecutor asked Saudi Arabia who sent Khashoggi's killers. I mean, it is a fundamental question, who made that order and who is being protected.
Exactly right, and the Turkish president has, in the last 10 minutes, been reported as speaking to his party at the parliament in Ankara. There he said that he'd briefed the leaders of France and Germany fully on their investigation, but he said a game is being played to protect someone in Saudi Arabia. Now, he has in the past pointed the finger at the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman. He wasn't explicit this time round, but certainly that would be the implication of his comments. He believes that the Saudis aren't forthcoming, they're not giving all the information in case this creates the picture that points specifically in one direction and causes embarrassment, political discomfort and international outcry against one person in particular. So he is not happy with the way the Saudis are handling this investigation. He may not know, as we've been reporting, that the statement from 18 of the people currently being held in Saudi Arabia have now been handed over to the chief prosecutor here in Istanbul. They will have to translate that from the Arabic and into Turkish and then go through it to see where the stories match from the information that they have, and also if it matches up with the statements that they've taken from more than 40 local staff who they have interviewed in the days after Jamal Khashoggi's initial disappearance, and as we know now, it was his killing. And so President Erdogan being very strong again. We know that he has spoken to Mohammed bin Salman just in the last few days. There was an impression given by Mohammed bin Salman that things had been slightly smoothed over. Certainly with his most recent public comments, one on Saturday and then again today, President Erdogan is definitely saying that there is a problem. The Saudis aren't being open and transparent, and he thinks the reason they're doing that is to protect someone back in Saudi Arabia, the person who may well have given the order to kill Jamal Khashoggi.
For the moment, we'll leave it there, Alan. Thank you. Sri Lanka's ousted Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe has spoken to protesters who've gathered outside his residence. Now, he's been refusing to leave since the president decided to replace him. Bernard Smith is our correspondent. He joins us live now from Colombo. Bernard, what seems to be going on now behind you?
Well, so at the end of the street behind me is where ousted Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe has been holed up. It's the official Prime Minister's residence, and he's been refusing to leave. This is what is ending now. It's a very large protest. Many thousands of people here in Colombo protesting outside that residence. When Wickremesinghe, ousted Prime Minister, came out to speak to them, they want Parliament to be reconvened. What's happened is that Wickremesinghe has been fired by Sri Lanka's President Sirisena and replaced by former President Mahinda Rajapaksa. Now, everybody here says that is unconstitutional because Sri Lanka's constitution has been changed. It gives power to Parliament, takes power away from the President, and the Prime Minister, who has a parliamentary majority, is the one who should be anointed, made Prime Minister. The protesters say the President's ignored that, and he's also suspended Parliament. The suspicion being that while Parliament remains suspended, the appointed Prime Minister Rajapaksa can gather support and get enough people on his side to show that he has a parliamentary majority. But everybody here very uncomfortable, very unhappy about that. Wickremesinghe has called his people out on the streets to protest and to protect democracy, he says, because he is the legal Prime Minister.
And of course, Bernard, as you say, Parliament has been suspended for 2 weeks so that the incoming Prime Minister, Mahinda Rajapaksa, can gain the numbers to convince the public at large that he does have parliamentary consensus. It's not unusual for Sri Lankan politicians to switch sides. What's the general vibe you're getting on the ground as to whether that is a reality or could be a reality?
Well, before all of this happened, the understanding was that Prime Minister Wickremesinghe commanded a coalition, and that coalition had a majority. Now, Rajapaksa says, no, I've got enough MPs. Well, the people here are challenging him to say, well, you've got enough MPs. Why is Parliament suspended? Reconvene Parliament now. And even the Speaker of Sri Lanka's parliament has presented a list signed by more than 120-odd MPs saying that parliament should be reconvened now. The suspicion is, and there's been plenty of tweets about this from former ministers and MPs, is that in fact MPs are being paid off. They're being paid, being given money to support the incoming Prime Minister Rajapaksa. Now, obviously there's no evidence of that, but that is the claims being made by some MPs, that cash is changing hands to come and support Rajapaksa. Highly inflammatory and controversial allegations for people to make, but they say that's the only way that he could get this support. So,
for the moment, Bernard, we'll leave it there. Thank you. Bernard Smith, our correspondent there in Colombo. Bangladesh and Myanmar have agreed to begin returning Rohingya refugees to Rakhine State by mid-November. 15 senior officials from Myanmar are now in the Bangladeshi capital Dhaka to discuss the plan. They're due to visit the refugee camps in Cox's Bazar later. Last year, nearly 1 million Rohingya refugees fled what the UN calls a campaign of violence by the Myanmar military. Rights groups are demanding that any repatriation must be voluntary and dignified. It's been revealed the Indonesian airliner, which crashed on Monday, had technical problems the day before, and its pilots reported more issues just before the Boeing 737 went down with 189 passengers and crew on board. Deep-sea divers are searching for the black box recorders of the Lion Air flight. Wayne Hay reports from Jakarta.
Piece by piece, search and rescue teams bring back what they've found floating on the Java Sea. ID cards, passports and other personal items belonging to some of the 189 people on board are being sorted. Body parts are being taken to a nearby hospital where relatives have the harrowing task of making identifications.
Our family is still hoping she survives. We still have a big hope for that. But if she did not survive, we pray that her remains can quickly be discovered so we can take her home to be buried.
Finding out what happened in the final moments of Lion Air Flight 610 and why it crashed into the sea soon after takeoff is likely to take a long time.
My father was on board, but we still don't know. We are still hoping for the best because there hasn't been an official statement from Lion Air. So we are still hoping for the best.
But increasingly, speculation is turning to a problem with the instruments in the cockpit, giving false readings. Lion Air has confirmed there was a technical problem with the plane before it took off from Bali to Jakarta on Sunday. It says the issue was fixed, but during that flight, the pilot reported problems with the flight control system. And satellite data collected by independent flight monitoring websites shows unusual fluctuations in speed and altitude soon after it took off from Bali. The situation stabilised and Lion Air says the problem was fixed again when it landed in Jakarta and it was cleared to take off on Monday morning. It crashed some 12 minutes after it left the Indonesian capital. Small pieces of debris are being found, but the search for the main wreckage continues.
Today we've adjusted our calculations and widened our search areas to 18.5 kilometers.
On the Java Sea, more than 800 people are involved in the search for debris, bodies and clues to what happened to Lion Air Flight 610. Wayne Hay, Al Jazeera, Jakarta.
In Tunisia, at least 20 people have been wounded after a suicide bomber blew herself up in the capital, Tunis. 15 policemen are amongst the injured. The country has been under a state of emergency since 2015, when dozens of people were killed in a series of ISIL attacks.
I regret to say that security personnel are always paying the heavy toll, paying it in blood. I am sure officials will identify the causes and consequences. Such attacks undermine the state, its authority and stature. I believe any gathering must be licensed, as it is a right guaranteed by the Constitution. We thought we had driven tourism out of our cities into the caves, yet it is now in the heart of the capital city.
Well, David Chater joins us now from Tunis with the very latest. David, what seems to be the reaction to that suicide attack now?
Well, as you can imagine, amongst the ordinary people here, one of shock and dismay that bloodshed has returned to the streets of the capital. Now, the Tunisian president, Beji Caid Essebsi, is actually on a trip to Germany to meet Angela Merkel at the moment. And he perhaps best summed up the feeling and the mood here. He said that Essentially, they thought they had defeated terrorism and driven them out of the cities and into the caves, as he put it. But now, once again, they've returned to the very heart of the capital. Now, this is extraordinary because we haven't seen any of these terrorist attacks like this since 2015. The country, as you've said, is under a state of emergency. In 2015, there were scores of people killed in a series of attacks, including many British tourists on a beach resort. Now, since then, they thought that they have actually managed to control this threat, mainly coming from ISIL, the so-called Islamic State, and militant groups in neighboring Libya. But it does show you how easy it is to mount these sort of attacks. Now, the woman involved, a 30-year-old who set off the grenades at the police checkpoint, is from an eastern coastal city. She told her parents that she was going to Tunis to look for a job. And it's not known that she has any affiliations with any extremists, and there has been no claim so far of any responsibility. But just shows you how difficult it is for the authorities, for the special forces, for the police to actually try and control this. So a deep sense of dismay and shock here in Tunis.
Indeed. For the moment, we'll leave it there, David, and wait for more updates and come back to you as and when. Thank you. Well, we've been given another snapshot of our impact on the planet, and it's alarming. Conservation group, the Worldwide Fund for Nature, says humans have brought about cataclysmic destruction to Earth's biodiversity. It says populations of mammals, birds, fish, reptiles and amphibians declined by 60% between 1970 and 2014. The largest losses, almost 90%, were seen in Central and Southern America. The organisation says humans are squarely to blame, but with habitat destruction, overfishing and overhunting all having an impact. And all of this isn't just having an environmental effect. The WWF highlights how nature provides goods and services worth about $125 trillion each year. Well, for more of this, I'm joined now by Marco Lambertini in Switzerland via Skype. He's the Director General of the World Wildlife Federation. Good to have you with us on the programme. It seems from your findings that man is the greatest threat to biodiversity of the planet. So how concerned should we be?
Yes, definitely. Human activities are the ones to blame. There is no escape there. And all the issues that you just mentioned, from deforestation, overfishing, coral reef bleaching, climate change, of course, extinction, are all driven by our growth in population, particularly by our acceleration of consumption of natural resources. You know, the good things is that, the good news perhaps is that this generation is perhaps the first one to actually know exactly what the situation is, know the problems, and frankly begin to understand the consequences. And as you say, it's something that we should be worried, because this is not just about preserving the wonderful wildlife that we share the planet with, and we have the moral responsibility to share the planet with.
Indeed, I mean, specifics both on
increasingly us.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Specifics both on land and sea are alarming in your report, and it's worrying. But is it easy? Just to focus on one area that needs particular attention right here, right now?
Yes, I think the three key dimensions that are actually driving the whole impact on nature. The first one is the way we produce, we generate our own energy, so climate change. And so shift to renewable energy is a must. And we have a Paris Agreement that drives the government and corporates in that direction, which is exciting and encouraging. The second one is how we produce our food. Today, the major impact on the planet is due to food production, conversion of forest, and the utilization of pesticides and fertilizers. And so finding ways to produce food with less resources, with less inputs, with less pesticides and water and land, and it is possible through technology and through behavioral change, both in terms of production, but also the way we consume food. So changing the food system is fundamental to win this battle. And thirdly is how we invest our money. Financial flows that support the wrong development model until now could actually be redirected to support clean energy and sustainable food production, for example. So it's about achieving harmony between what we need to produce to sustain ourselves and to develop but also what we need to protect in terms of forest and ocean and rivers and atmosphere and biodiversity to manage, to maintain those systems that frankly provide every day to us very important services for free. The air, the water, medicines and so on.
Indeed, organisations like yourself can certainly highlight the issues. I mean, we have periodic climate change conferences, and small gains and promises can easily be reneged on, as we've seen, under pressure from politicians. And that can be the real deal breaker when science is being rebuffed and people power ignored.
Yes, and that's why we are calling for, so we're seeing a lot of progress with the Paris Agreement. We know it's not enough. We know we are not achieving it, the ambitions fast enough, but definitely climate change now is at the top of the political and corporate agenda and is part of the dialogue in society. And it's super important. Acknowledging the problem is the first step to resolving it. On nature loss, ocean, forest, rivers, biodiversity, we're not there yet. We don't understand the implications fully. We take nature for granted. We need to begin to realize that nature is so important to us, as important as climate change, and we need a new deal for nature like we had a deal for climate in Paris. This is what we are asking for by 2020.
Well, we shall see what does happen. For the moment, Marco Lambertini from the World Wildlife Federation joining us from Switzerland. Thanks so much for your time, sir. Australia's east coast has become a global deforestation hotspot. The WWF says that part of the world is likely to lose 3 million hectares of trees in the next 15 years, eroding animal habitats such as the koalas. Andrew Thomas reports now from Port Stephens.
They are one of two animals Australia is known for. But unlike kangaroos, koala numbers are falling fast. Cars kill them, as do dogs and disease. But the central cause, one that lies behind all those threats, is human destruction of the places koalas live, forcing them closer to people and each other.
It all comes back to habitat loss. If a koala has lost habitat, they have to come down, search for habitat, which then makes them have to cross roads, so they're susceptible to being hit by cars and attacked by dogs as well.
North of Sydney, this small rehabilitation centre is about to be transformed into a full koala hospital, costing $2 million. The state government of New South Wales will pay for it, but that's the same government, say campaigners, which is allowing, even encouraging, the destruction of koala habitat.
We are incredibly appreciative that we're getting this hospital. We need this hospital, but the laws that allow the habitat clearing, it's give on one hand and take on the other.
Last year, New South Wales relaxed laws controlling the amount of land farmers can clear of trees. As a result, says a new report, land clearing rates have tripled. Those behind the report say that if current trends continue, koalas could be extinct in the wild in New South Wales by 2050.
It's really shocking, and it's certainly within our power to stop. But if we don't stop habitat destruction, we will be the ones that will see these animals in the wild for the last time.
New South Wales' Environment Minister turned down a request for an interview, but the state government says old land clearing laws were too restrictive. Farming and development does not need to threaten koalas. But this patch of wetland forest north of Sydney illustrates the subjective nature of the decisions. It's owned by the Education Department of the state government, which doesn't need it for a school, so 2 years ago sold it to a developer. After environmentalists started petitions and campaigns, the state government said it had made a mistake and is now trying to buy the land back for more than it was sold.
One part of government doesn't communicate with the other. Before any government department flogs off land, they're supposed to go around to other government departments and ask, do you want it? Nobody asks the Department of Environment, as far as we know, do you want this land?
The more land that disappears, the more animal hospitals will be needed. Andrew Thomas, Al Jazeera, Port Stephens, Australia.
Now, storms in Italy have killed at least 8 people, including a woman whose home was swept away by a mudslide. There have been widespread flooding. In Venice, the water levels have risen to a 10-year high. Well, in a few moments, we'll have the weather with Rob, but still ahead here on Al Jazeera. All change in Berlin, but who'll replace German Chancellor Angela Merkel when she steps aside? And in sport, Inter Milan keep Juventus in their sights at the top of the Italian league. Sana will be here with more sport later.
Hello. 4 days ago, Super Typhoon Yutu went through Saipan. You may have seen this already. It was a pretty devastating storm. It was a super typhoon at the time, and it's since then gone directly westwards towards the Philippines, where it currently sits. Now, there is some good news in this story. Having been a super typhoon and with a very visible eye, it has reduced its strength to some degree, and its cloud frame as well, but it's still covering all of Luzon. It's just the eye of it, what there is left, has gone to the western side now. Now, all I can find so far from the point of view of the amount of rain that's fallen is not that impressive, about 100 millimetres. It has not finished. The winds were around about 140 kilometres per hour typically, and gusting rather more than that. But it has a course to follow, obviously. This is where it sits at the moment. It has generated waves of 10 metres in height. Now, they're a little less now that it's gone across Luzon, but it's now got about a day, 2 days worth of battering on the western side of northern Luzon, bringing a storm surge of 2 or 3 metres, quite possibly, and persistent rain. And it's usually rain that does the damage in the northern Philippines, or indeed in China, because the course takes it towards the coast of Fujian. Still, in the next 24 hours, we're just looking at rain, but the total could end up being 400 millimetres.
In the 1870s, hundreds of Algerians were banished to the farthest corner of an empire where their descendants still live today.
My grandparents died with a heavy heart. They left everything behind.
We reclaim our Algerian identity. It's always present inside.
As this French territory in the Pacific prepares to vote on independence, Al Jazeera World tells the story of exile in New Caledonia.
One of the really special things about working for Al Jazeera is that even as a camera woman, I get to have so much input and contribution to a story. I feel we cover this region better than anyone else.
Working for Al Jazeera is very challenging, in Lebanon in particular, because you have a lot of people that are divided on political issues.
We are with the people. We live to tell the real stories. Al Jazeera's mandate is to deliver in-depth journalism without fear and favor to the audience across the globe.
Welcome back. You're watching Al Jazeera. It's the news app with me, Sahil Ramla. A reminder of our top stories. Turkey's president says he believes some sort of game is being played out over the murder of Jamal Khashoggi in order to protect someone. Recep Tayyip Erdogan also says he's spoken to the leaders of Germany and France and briefed them on new details on the killing of the Saudi journalist. Sources have told Al Jazeera that the Saudi side has handed over testimonies of 18 suspects being held in the kingdom to Turkey. Also ousted Sri Lankan Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe has addressed protesters outside the official residence. He's refusing to leave. His supporters are demanding Parliament be reconvened. President Maithripala Sirisena replaced Wickremesinghe with former President Mahinda Rajapaksa and suspended Parliament for 2 weeks so he could gain support. And Bangladesh and Myanmar have agreed to begin returning Rohingya refugees to Rakhine State by mid-November. 15 senior officials from Myanmar are now in the Bangladeshi capital Dhaka to discuss the plan. Last year, around 1 million Rohingya refugees fled what the UN has called a campaign of violence by the Myanmar military. Now, the race is on for the top job in Europe's biggest economy after German Chancellor Angela Merkel announced that she'll leave politics at the end of her term in 2021. Nadine Barber has the latest for us from Berlin. And one wonders what the reaction to this news has been, Nadine.
Well, Sahel, a lot of the headlines in the newspapers here in Germany this morning are predictable, calling it the end of an era. One of the mainstream papers saying that the country will grow to miss Angela Merkel, even though she has been increasingly a divisive figure here in Germany. There's no surprise that she's not planning to try to run again for Chancellor in 2021. But the surprise on Monday was that she says she will not try to become party leader again at the end end of this year. It's being, the analysts are saying here that she wants to try to ensure a smooth transition, but big question marks over who she'll hand over to. Big question marks over how her party is going to fare in future. They've just lost a couple of regional elections this year. Rather, they've just performed badly in those elections, seen their support slump, but so too have the centre-left Social Democrats. So there's a lot to play for right now in Germany. But for now, people are looking back at what Angela Merkel has meant for the country and exactly how strong a party she leaves. Angela Merkel's message to leaders of her party, the Christian Democrats or the CDU, is clear. It's time to begin a new chapter. On Monday, she announced, to nobody's great surprise, that this would be her last term as Germany's Chancellor. But she also plans to quit as party leader by the end of the year.
I will not put myself forward again as candidate for the CDU chair. Secondly, this fourth term is my last as German Chancellor. At the federal election in 2021, I will not stand again as the Chancellor candidate, nor as a candidate for the Bundestag. And for the sake of protocol, I won't seek any further political offices.
Angela Merkel's been Chancellor for 13 years. Stepping down as leader of her party, a position she's held for nearly 2 decades, means the race will soon be on to find a replacement, allowing a new figure to build a profile ahead of the next election. The announcement came after Merkel's CDU experienced big losses in a regional vote in the western state of Hesse. The party came first and will still be in charge along with the Greens, but it saw an 11% drop in support. It was the second electoral setback in as many weeks for Merkel's Conservative alliance. And nationally, her partners in government, the Social Democrats, have threatened to end what's known as the Grand Coalition if the downward trend continues.
Her party has tolerated her because she was able to negotiate coalitions where they would be the strongest partner. That's been less so since the last elections. The Social Democrats would only join the government if they got the post as foreign minister and finance minister. And many in the party say, well, you sold us too cheaply.
Of course, any period of political uncertainty here in Germany will also be a worry for the European Union at a time when the bloc's dealing with a budget crisis in Italy, Brexit, and not least, rising populism across the continent. That's why they'll be paying close attention to which figure the CDU lines up as Merkel's successor and where the main challenges come from.
Let's return to our top story in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. We'll go straight over to Alan Fisher in Istanbul. We know that the Saudi chief prosecutor, Saud al-Mujab, I believe, has left, Alan, but also lines coming from the Turkish president where and we're quoting, he's saying that Khashoggi's murder needs to be solved there's no point in trying to protect the culprits.
Exactly. The prosecutor has just left. He spent, by my estimate, just 100 minutes in there. He didn't appear in public this time round. A car was taken into the compound itself, and then his convoy disappeared. Police escort, of course, local media chasing him, trying to get a picture, but the windows darkened out. So now he has been to the scene of the crime. He's been able to see where Jamal Khashoggi was killed. He spent a good 100 minutes there. He was maybe talking to some of the staff inside the building. It would give him a better idea, and of course he is the man who's overseeing the current investigation of 18 people who are being detained in Saudi Arabia in connection with the killing. As for the president's comments, he's been speaking to his party in Ankara. It's a weekly meeting, and he said that Saudi Arabia is playing a game, essentially suggesting that they're not being open enough in an investigation that they said would be open and transparent, and he believes they're doing that to try and protect someone. Now, in the past, he's pointed the finger at Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. He wasn't so explicit this time, but we know that previous statements he's made since the phone call he had with the man known as MBS, he's been much more strident in his criticism of Saudi Arabia. Now, given the fact that Saudi Arabia was initially reluctant to hand over the statements of the 18 people who are currently being held in Saudi Arabia, somehow there was a change of mind in the last last 12 hours or so overnight. Clearly, the chief prosecutor took some advice from senior figures in Riyadh. Those statements were handed over at a meeting with the chief prosecutor of Istanbul in the last couple of hours. They are all in Arabic, so they'll have to be translated. But the Turks will consider that a win, not a big win, but a big win as they move this investigation forward. But the outstanding question still remains: where is the body of Jamal Khashoggi?
For the moment, Alan, we'll leave it there, of course. Come back to you with further updates through the day. Thank you. In Bangladesh, opposition leader Khalida Zia has had her 5-year jail sentence doubled to 10. She was sentenced in February for stealing money from an orphanage where she was Prime Minister for the second time, and she was convicted on Monday for misappropriating $300,000 from the charity. Zia, who plans to run in the general election in December, says the corruption charges are aimed at keeping her out of politics. The Japanese steel company, or a Japanese steel company, has been ordered to compensate 4 South Koreans for their forced labour during World War II. South Korea's Supreme Court ruled that Nippon Steel must pay each plaintiff $87,000. The company has called the ruling regrettable. Japan occupied South Korea from 1910 to 1945 and is accused of never fully apologising for paying reparations to South Koreans who were forced to work without pay. Well, for more on this, I'm joined now by Tomohiko Taniguchi in Tokyo via Skype. He's a professor at Keio University and a special advisor to the cabinet of Shinzo Abe. Nice to have you back on the programme, sir. A real diplomatic crisis in the offing, despite an international agreement post-war to normalise relations and iron out these issues.
Indeed, in 1965, both nations came to agree on a treaty that settled these problems completely and finally. The wording, completely finally, has no room for misunderstanding. Nonetheless, the decision that the court of South Korea reached today is a breach of the promise that they made. So South Korea means that they're not paying attention to the internationally accepted norm, and it is extremely regrettable and totally unacceptable.
Well, just briefly then, if the courts have deemed this as such a way forward for those looking for reparations, do you think the floodgates are about to open?
It is not something that the Japanese government can do anything about. It is not something, indeed, any Japanese company can do anything about. It is in the sole domain and responsibility of the South Korean government to remedy the damage done to the bilateral relationship, because it is the responsibility that the South Korean government must pay attention to, so long as it is a player, responsible player under accepted international regime, international laws.
How significant is the case then when we've seen similar cases about compensation and apologies, for example, from South Korean comfort women, a highly contentious issue in both countries and often causing diplomatic unease when these women raise their voices in Seoul and beyond?
The comfort women issue is rather more complicated because over the last couple of years, again, both nations agreed to solve that issue completely, finally, and irreversibly. And then South Korea seems to be, again, moving the goalpost a little bit further in order for these promises unable to be fulfilled by both parties. And South Korean government must obey to something that their own government promised. And that applies also to the fundamental treaty forged in 1965. So South Korean government, if it fails to take appropriate actions, is actually overthrowing the legal foundation for the bilateral relationship, I must say.
We'll just see what happens, certainly in the coming days. For the moment, Tomohiko Taniguchi, thanks so much for joining us from Tokyo.
You're welcome.
Chile, the United States and Israel are the first foreign trips planned by Brazil's new president. At home, many are worried about Jair Bolsonaro and his controversial comments about women, as well as gay, black and indigenous Brazilians. From Rio de Janeiro, Teresa Bow reports.
André Rodriguez lives in Rocinha, the largest slum in Rio de Janeiro. People living here have to deal with poverty and insecurity every day. But now that Jair Bolsonaro was elected president, many are not sure of what's coming next.
We have seen a war here between drug traffickers, and that affects our economy inside this slum. Many shops had to close because they couldn't make it. For things to change, we need investment in education that's missing here. With education, we wouldn't have so many kids involved in drug trafficking.
Bolsonaro has promised to fight the crime wave that is killing thousands every year and to reinvigorate Brazil's economy. For years, those who live in the favelas have voted for Lula da Silva's center-left Workers' Party. But it was different this time.
Even though Jair Bolsonaro insulted in the past black people and minorities and could pass laws that could end up hurting the poor, he has managed to get votes in favelas like this one. The main reason is because he represents change.
Johnny Silva says that the economy is his main priority.
I am worried about the economy. It has lost investors with the crisis. Bolsonaro says a lot about security and corruption, but he hasn't talked much about the economy.
Bolsonaro has promised to liberalize the economy, privatize state companies and reduce the deficit. He has also said that Brazil will be closer to the United States and Israel. He's expected to be more aggressive with China. But analysts say it won't be easy for him to put into practice many of his campaign promises.
It's not going to be so easy for Brazil to do whatever Trump does, because Trump can fight with China, because the United States have a high deficit in trade balance with China. Brazil has a very high surplus in trade balances, so it's not the same. And China is much more important for Brazil than Brazil to China. It's not like the US.
Anger towards the political class has helped Bolsonaro win the presidency. But even though his violent rhetoric scares many in Brazil, there are those who want their daily lives to change. Teresa Bow, Al Jazeera, Rio de Janeiro.
Well, still ahead on the Al Jazeera News Hour in Sport, we'll bring you all of the thrills and spills from the Indoor Skydiving World Cup. Sana will have those details after the break. Welcome back. Time for sport. Here's Sana.
Thank you very much. So, well, Julian Lopetegui has been sacked as the Real Madrid head coach just 3 months into his first season in charge. Well, Lopetegui only took over in the summer but made the worst start to a season of any Real coach in the last 70 years. Sunday's 5-1 thrashing by rivals Barcelona in El Clasico was their 5th defeat in 7 games and left them 9th in the Spanish league. Well, Real have not won in the league for more than a month, something the fans are also blaming on the players.
We have very comfortable players who earn a lot of money and don't have feeling for the badge. Sometimes this is no longer Real Madrid, it's more players from all over the world. It is more business than football, and I don't see a compact team there.
I think they are fed up of victories and money. I think that if they are fed up of victories, they have to go somewhere else, and others with more eagerness should come. I don't see a team with hope, and the coach Lopetegui wasn't able to give them hope either.
Well, it's been a turbulent year for Lopetegui, who has lost 2 high-profile jobs in 5 months. The 52-year-old was sacked as Spain's head coach on the eve of the World Cup in June, when he announced his move to Madrid behind the Spanish Football Association's back. For more on that, we go live to our correspondent Lee Wellings from our London studio. Lee, this doesn't come entirely as a shock, does it?
No, it's not a surprise. No Real Madrid coach is going to survive 4 defeats and a draw in their past 5 league matches, 9th in the table. This was completely unacceptable to the president and the board and the fans, but a 5-1 defeat against Barcelona, whilst you suspected that Lopetegui would go quickly, that 5-1 defeat, there's no coming back from that, a humiliation for Real Madrid. And a strange scenario, of course, because they are the European champions. Many regard them as the world's biggest club. 8 of their players are on the 30-man shortlist for the Ballon d'Or. So successful were they. But I think Zinedine Zidane timed his departure very well. He could see that a lot of those players had peaked. And of course, Real Madrid don't now have Cristiano Ronaldo. He makes such a difference, could have won some of those games that ended in defeat with just a vital intervention, and I think the club are really missing him, and it's too late for Lopetegui.
Well, not a great year for Lopetegui, as we mentioned, but Lee, do you think what happened with Spain have contributed to his terrible time at Real?
It's an extraordinary situation, isn't it? There has to be a lot of sympathy for Lopetegui, because he was given this chance to manage a club that he'd have known there's no bigger job in club football than being the manager of Real Madrid. He'd done very well in how Spain had qualified. They looked very strong going into that World Cup. And his professionalism should possibly have carried him through for a good World Cup for Spain. But of course, he was sacked just 2 days before. Turmoil that the Spanish team out there didn't recover from. He certainly hasn't recovered, because going to Real Madrid under all this pressure, he hasn't settled down. Does it make him a really bad coach? No, of course it doesn't. And the way football works, he will be snapped up eventually by another club, perhaps even a big club. But it's just been a terrible and unforgettable few months for him.
Lee, how do you think Real Madrid are going to move on from this, and who do you think will take that hot seat?
Well, they've definitely been lining up Antonio Conte, who hasn't been in work since he left Chelsea. But the reports within Spain are that his demands are high, whether it's the money, the terms and conditions. And some of the Real Madrid senior players haven't made the right noises about wanting him on board. So it's not certain that they will be able to get Antonio Conte, even though he remains the favourite. What it does mean is that Santiago Solari steps up from the Real Madrid B team. They like that progression. It's the progression that Zinedine Zidane made. And he has a very encouraging run of fixtures, easier fixtures coming up. So he could make a good start and could make a big claim for that job.
Lee Wellings live from London. Thank you very much for that. Well, Inter Milan have moved into second in the Italian Serie A thanks to a 3-0 win at Lazio. Mauro Icardi took his tally to 6 goals for the season, the Inter captain getting his second of the match here in Rome. A 6th win in a row for the visitors, putting them 6 points behind defending champions Juventus. And LeBron James marked 15 years as a professional basketball player on Monday, but didn't get to celebrate as his Los Angeles Lakers lost again. LeBron's layup to JaVale McGee put the Lakers ahead at the Minnesota Timberwolves. But then a moment that we're not used to seeing from one of the game's greats. LeBron losing the ball with less than 2 minutes to go and helping the Timberwolves to 124-120 win. The Lakers have won just twice since LeBron joined in the summer. While the Milwaukee Bucks and Toronto Raptors were the only unbeaten teams in the NBA going into their showdown on Monday. Now it's just the Bucks. They won 124-109. Milwaukee's 7 victories makes this their best start to the season since 1972. Tennis now, Novak Djokovic and Rafael Nadal will go head-to-head for the world #1 spot when they play at the Paris Masters this week. Nadal still holds the crown and is making his comeback for the first time since limping out of the US Open. Meanwhile, home favourite Richard Gasquet has booked his place in the second round of the tournament. He beat Canadian teenager Denis Shapovalov in straight sets 6-4, 7-6. Next up for him, it's defending champion Jack Sock. The World Gymnastics Championships are taking place right now in Doha. China took the gold medal in the men's team event on Monday, but only just. They edged out Russia by only 0.05 of a point after a couple of below-par performances. But they all count. All 3 teams on the podium, China, Russia and Japan, earned an automatic spot in the 2020 Tokyo Olympics. Now to some athletes who get a bit of help against gravity in their quest for gold. This is the Indoor Skydiving World Cup, also known as body flight. Athletes fly about in a vertical wind tunnel, performing speed and free routines, either individually or in teams. More than 100 teams from 25 countries have taken part. Team France won gold in the 4-way formation skydiving, while a dynamic duo from Singapore won the dynamic 2-way event. And that's it for me.
Thanks very much. I love that. I've done it before in the US. Had a great time. Excellent. You have been watching the Al Jazeera News Hour with me, Sahil Rahman. You can follow all of those stories on our website at aljazeera.com. Laura Kyle is up next with another full half hour from Sana, me and the whole of the News Hour team. Thanks for your time and company.
A career reporting to the world.
Where was it? Here?
One journalist documents life beyond the headlines. But certain stories can change us.
Filming the craziest story. Well, I mean, we didn't know it was going to be a crazy story, but it turned into one.
A unique journey into what it means to be human. The things we keep. A witness documentary on Al Jazeera.
An unreported world on Al Jazeera.
US and British companies have announced the biggest discovery of natural gas in West Africa. But what to do with these untapped natural resources is already a source of heated debate.
Nothing much has changed. They still spend most of their days looking for water from dry riverbeds like this one.
5 years on, these Syrians still feel battered. For even those who managed to escape their country haven't truly been able to escape the war.
In South Korea, around 2 million dogs are eaten every year. But now animal rights groups want the ancient tradition taken off the menu. 101 East investigates Korean dogs, friend or food on Al Jazeera.
Al Jazeera, wherever you are.
Saudi Arabia hands over suspects' testimonies in the Jamal Khashoggi murder as Turkey makes accusations of game playing.
I want to bury the body of the beloved Jamal.
A plea from Khashoggi's fiancée as she urges world leaders to put pressure on Saudi Arabia. Hello there, I'm Laura Kyle. This is Al Jazeera live from Doha. Also coming up, going nowhere, Sri Lanka's ousted Prime Minister rallies supporters outside the official residence he's refusing to leave. And Indonesia's second worst ever plane crash. More debris is recovered as deep-sea divers search for the black box flight recorders. Turkey's president says a game is being played over the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi to protect someone. Recep Tayyip Erdogan's comments come as Saudi Arabia's top prosecutor met Turkish officials for a second time. And sources tell Al Jazeera that he handed over the testimonies of 18 suspects. The Saudi side had refused to do so in a first round of talks on Monday. There are still disagreements, however, over where the suspects should be tried. Let's go straight to Alan Fisher. He's in Istanbul, outside the Saudi consulate for us. So first of all, Alan, we've got Erdogan keeping up the pressure on the Saudis to reveal who ordered the killing.
Well, it's been a busy couple of hours, hasn't it, here in Istanbul and also in Ankara. First of all, we had the chief prosecutor from Saudi Arabia coming to the scene of the crime. He hasn't been here, of course. He's been in Istanbul for 2 days. He met with his Turkish counterpart on Monday, and then he spent 90 minutes inside the consulate itself. He just left in the last 20 minutes or so. He was there looking at where Jamal Khashoggi was killed, in which rooms, and obviously having seen the statements of 18 people currently being held in Saudi Arabia in connection with the killing, he will be able to match up their statements with the layout of the building. Now, as he was doing that, we were hearing from President Erdogan, who was speaking in Ankara to a meeting of his party, something that happens every week. And there he again repeated the fact that he believes that Saudi Arabia are dragging their feet on the investigation because they're trying to protect someone senior in Saudi Arabia who ordered the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. In the past, he's pointed the finger specifically at the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. This time, he wasn't quite as explicit, but obviously he believes that although 18 people are currently being held in Saudi Arabia, that someone much higher up the food chain, for want of a better phrase, is responsible for actually ordering the killing. So where are we between Saudi Arabia and Turkish cooperation? Well, when they met on Monday, the Saudis said that they wanted all audio and video recordings that the Turks allegedly have from inside the building at the time Jamal Khashoggi was killed. The Turks turned that down. They said that they were still putting together an indictment against the people that they believe were responsible. Also, that crosses in to the idea of revealing how Turkey got that information, gets into intelligence gathering, not something that I'm sure they want to show to the Saudis. In return, they said that they wanted the statements of these 18 people currently being held in Saudi Arabia. Initially, Saudi Arabia said no, but when the chief prosecutor went back on Tuesday, obviously after consulting with senior figures in the government in Riyadh overnight, he then handed over those documents. Now, those statements are all in Arabic. There is a stipulation that they won't be released to the public, but they will have to be translated from Arabic into Turkish, and that may well give the prosecutor a much clearer idea of what happened inside the building. But the outstanding question still remains for Saudi Arabia, and this is being posed both internationally and also here in Turkey itself. What happened to the body of Jamal Khashoggi? Who was this Turkish person who was given the task of disposing the body? What did they do with it? Are we talking about a whole body? Are we talking about body parts? And so Saudi Arabia is coming under pressure to make that clear, not just to the Turkish authorities, but to the family of Jamal Khashoggi.
Absolutely. We also saw the Saudi prosecutor coming and leaving from the Saudi consulate there behind you. Do we know what he was doing there?
Well, we presume just looking at the layout, matching up what he's heard from all these statements, perhaps getting an idea of the floor plan to give him a better idea, perhaps even talking to staff who've been behind the fences now for more than 2 weeks. It's getting on to a month as well. And we also know that the Turkish investigation is also continuing. We know that they're looking at the drains around the Consul General's accommodation, which is not far from where I'm standing. Less than 5 minutes would take you there if you were walking. They've sent down cameras into the sewers, and they say they're going to analyse the results. They're also looking at a fireplace inside the Consul General's home. Now, they know that there was a big fire set there recently. Isn't the kind of weather where you would normally set a fire in Istanbul at this time of year, but different people have different tastes. But they're aware that not only was there a fire, it was cleaned up afterwards, and cleaned up extensively. How extensively? To the degree where none of the Turkish investigators could find a fingerprint in the room belonging to the Consul General, and so they're concerned about what may have been put in the fire, what may have been burned. They've taken soot samples from the chimney. Those too will be analysed. Now, these may seem kind of random and unconnected, but this is all about the Turkish investigators building up a bigger picture, which might give them an idea of what happened to Jamal Khashoggi's body.
Very interesting indeed. Alan, thanks for the update there from Istanbul. Well, Khashoggi's fiancée says she has no doubt of Saudi responsibility for his murder and is demanding the return of his body. Jonah Hull has more from a memorial service in London.
This was a memorial event recalling, in the words of the director of Middle East Monitor, Dr. Dawood Abdullah, the values that Jamal Khashoggi stood for: justice, freedom of the press, political accountabilities, values that he said were universal, resonating everywhere. It was also an event that saw perhaps the most public comments yet by Khashoggi's fiancée, Khadija Cengiz.
If only I knew that there were bloodthirsty, evil people waiting inside the consulate for my Jamal, I would have done all I could to prevent him from entering.
Ve sadece bilebilseydim içeride bir ölüm mangasının beklediğini.
If only I knew that a death squad was inside. Yet we never imagined such a level of barbarity, cruelty and evil could be waiting for Jamal.
Miss Cengiz described Khashoggi as a journalist and an intellectual whose words frightened unjust and greedy autocrats. She called on the Saudi authorities to reveal the whereabouts of his remains to allow a dignified burial.
Cemal bizim dünyamızda demokrasi,
He is a martyr for the struggle for democracy and freedom in our part of the world. I want to bury the body of the beloved Jamal. Therefore, I'm asking once again, where is his body?
And then there was this powerful political appeal to world leaders, taking particular aim at US President Donald Trump, whose invitation to visit the White House she has turned down.
I am, however, disappointed in the actions of the leadership in many countries, particularly in the US. President Trump should help reveal the truth and ensure justice be served. He should not pave the way for a cover-up of my fiancé's murder. Let's not let money taint our conscience and compromise our values.
A mix of emotion and grief, protest and politics, recalling a man and a journalist killed, apparently, for speaking his mind. Jonah Hull, Al Jazeera, Central London.
Sri Lanka's ousted Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe has spoken to protesters who've gathered outside his official residence. He's been refusing to leave since the president decided to replace him. Bernard Smith has this update.
The end of the street behind me is where ousted Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe has been holed up. It's the official Prime Minister's residence, and he's been refusing to leave. This is what is ending now is a very large protest. Many thousands of people here in Colombo protesting outside that residence. When Wickremesinghe, ousted Prime Minister, came out to speak to them, they want Parliament to be reconvened. What's happened is that Wickremesinghe has been fired by Sri Lanka's President Sirisena and replaced by former President Mahinda Rajapaksa. Now, everybody here says that is unconstitutional because Sri Lanka's constitution has been changed. It gives power to Parliament, takes power away from the President, and the Prime Minister, who has a parliamentary majority, is the one who should be anointed, made Prime Minister. The protesters say the President's ignored that, and he's also suspended Parliament. The suspicion being that while Parliament remains suspended, the appointed Prime Minister, Rajapaksa, can gather support and get enough people on his side to show that he has a parliamentary majority. But everybody here very uncomfortable, very unhappy about that. They and Wickramasinga has called his people out on the streets to protest and to protect democracy, he says, because he is the legal Prime Minister.
Bangladesh and Myanmar have agreed to begin returning Rohingya refugees by the middle of next month. 15 Myanmar government delegates are in the Bangladeshi capital, Dhaka. They're due to visit overcrowded refugee camps in Cox's Bazar. Around 750,000 Rohingya fled the military crackdown in Rakhine State last year. Rights groups say their return must be voluntary and dignified. Deep-sea divers are searching for the black box recorders from the second worst ever plane crash in Indonesia's history. 189 passengers and crew were on board the Lion Air flight. It's the low-cost carrier's 11th major accident in 16 years. Wayne Hay reports from Jakarta.
Piece by piece, search and rescue teams bring back what they've found floating on the Java Sea. ID cards, passports and other personal items belonging to some of the 189 people on board are being sorted. Body parts are being taken to a nearby hospital where relatives have the harrowing task of making identifications.
Our family is still hoping she survives. We still have a big hope for that. But if she did not survive, we pray that her remains can quickly be discovered so we can take her home to be buried.
Finding out what happened in the final moments of Lion Air Flight 610 and why it crashed into the sea soon after takeoff is likely to take a long time.
My father was on board, but we still don't know. We are still hoping for the best because there hasn't been an official statement from Lion Air. So we are still hoping for the best.
But increasingly, speculation is turning to a problem with the instruments in the cockpit, giving false readings. Lion Air has confirmed there was a technical problem with the plane before it took off from Bali to Jakarta on Sunday. It says the issue was fixed, but during that flight, the pilot reported problems with the flight control system. And satellite data collected by independent flight monitoring websites shows unusual fluctuations in speed and altitude soon after it took off from Bali. The situation stabilised and Lion Air says the problem was fixed again when it landed in Jakarta and it was cleared to take off on Monday morning. It crashed some 12 minutes after it left the Indonesian capital. Small pieces of debris are being found, but the search for the main wreckage continues.
Today we've adjusted our calculations and widened our search areas to 18.5 kilometers.
On the Java Sea, more than 800 people are involved in the search for debris, bodies and clues to what happened to Lion Air Flight 610. Wayne Hay, Al Jazeera, Jakarta.
Still ahead here on Al Jazeera. All change in Berlin. Who will replace German Chancellor Angela Merkel when she steps aside? And he gave the people a say, but hardly anyone voted. Critics blast Mexico's president-elect for scrapping a new airport.
Hello, it's getting colder slowly in this part of Asia, Japan, the northeast of China and the Korean Peninsula. The circulation here would suggest a northwesterly wind behind, and that air ought to be cold. We're still getting double figures out of it, though. Vladivostok is 10, Ulaanbaatar is still 8, and Beijing is 16. The sunshine helping greatly. Any active weather seems likely in Hokkaido, but this is rain, not snow yet. There might have been some snow at height, and give it another couple of weeks and there will be, but rain is really the story. And it's much cooler than it was, of course, but still got 19 in Tokyo. And if anything, we're a couple of degrees warmer in Pyongyang and in Seoul. Quiet change of season, I think you'll agree. Now, in China, it's not quite the same. Although mainland China is currently without cloud, just on the edge of your screen is the typhoon Yutu, which is on its way up towards the coast, somewhere east of Hong Kong in the next 24 hours or so. Now, obviously, increased wind and rain is an obvious consequence for that. It should miss Hong Kong as a direct hit, and it's also going to be below typhoon strength. But wet and windy would be the two conservative words to describe that sort of weather. South of it all, there's a line of potentially heavy rain that runs roughly from northern Borneo towards southern Thailand, Sumatra, and typically western Malaysia.
A journey of personal discovery.
my great-grandfather. He was a slave of the Lee property.
Al Jazeera's James Gannon explores his family's legacy of slave ownership.
Like my family's, status and wealth has benefited from their choice to enslave people.
And America's debt to black people today.
Some of us so scarred, we even scared to speak out, because it's a pride thing.
Al Jazeera correspondent, A Moral Debt.
Hello again, you're watching Al Jazeera. Here's a reminder of our top stories this hour. Turkey's president says he believes some sort of game is being played over the murder of Jamal Khashoggi in order to protect someone. Recep Tayyip Erdogan also says he's spoken to the leaders of Germany and France and briefed them on new details on the killing of the Saudi journalist. Sources have told Al Jazeera that the Saudi side has handed over the testimonies of 18 suspects being held in the kingdom to Turkey. Ousted Sri Lankan Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe has addressed protesters outside the official residence he's refusing to leave. His supporters are demanding Parliament be reconvened. President Maithripala Sirisena replaced Wickremesinghe with former President Mahinda Rajapaksa and then suspended Parliament for 2 weeks so that he could gain support. And after a meeting in Bangladesh, the Myanmar government has agreed to begin repatriating Rohingya refugees by the middle of next month. Rights groups say their return to Rakhine State must be voluntary and dignified. Around 3/4 of a million fled the military crackdown last year. In Tunisia, at least 20 people have been wounded after a suicide bomber blew herself up in the capital, Tunis. 15 policemen are amongst the injured. The country has been under a state of emergency since 2015, when dozens of people were killed in a series of ISIL attacks.
I regret to say that security personnel are always paying the heavy toll, paying it in blood. I am sure officials will identify the causes and consequences. Such attacks undermine the state, its authority and stature. I believe any gathering must be licensed, as it is a right guaranteed by the Constitution. We thought we had driven tourism out of our cities into the caves, yet it is now in the heart of the capital city.
David Chater has more now from Tunis.
As you can imagine, amongst the ordinary people here, one of shock and dismay that bloodshed has returned to the streets of the capital. Now, the Tunisian president, Beji Caid Sebsi, is actually on a trip to Germany to meet Angela Merkel at the moment. And he perhaps best summed up the feeling and the mood here. He said that essentially they thought they had defeated terrorism and driven them out of the cities and into the caves, as he put it. But now, once again, they've returned to the very heart of the capital. Now, this is extraordinary because we haven't seen any of these terrorist attacks like this since 2015. The woman involved, a 30-year-old who set off the grenades at the police checkpoint, is from an eastern coastal city. She told her parents that she was going to Tunis to look for a job. And it's not known that she has any affiliations with any extremists, and there has been no claim so far of any responsibility. But just shows you how difficult it is for the authorities, for the special forces, for the police to actually try and control this. So a deep sense of dismay and shock here in Tunis.
A Japanese steel company has been ordered to compensate 4 South Koreans for their forced labour during World War II. South Korea's Supreme Court ruled that Nippon Steel must pay each plaintiff $87,000. The company has called the ruling regrettable. Japan occupied South Korea from 1910 to 1945 and is accused of never fully apologising nor paying repatriations to South Koreans who were forced to work without pay. For more on this, we're joined by Se Wong-koo in Seoul via Skype. He's the publisher of Korea Expose. Good to speak to you once again. I mean, the Japanese here are saying that the South Korean government must remedy what it's calling a breach of international law. Is that something the South Korean government could do even if it wanted to?
Well, so this is the point of contention.
Japan argues that any responsibility that Japan has towards South Korea for the potential crimes or atrocities committed during the colonial period were already settled in the agreement signed between the two countries in 1965. And this is a view that some of the administrations have certainly upheld, but under others, it has been called into question. Keep in mind, the decision that came out today is not from the Korean government. It is from the judiciary. The Supreme Court ruled quite with a large majority that Japanese should be compelled to pay for at least the suffering that was borne by these workers who were forced into labor by the Japanese government in the pre-1945 era. But, of course, this is bound to have a very strong implication for bilateral ties.
Is there a surprise there among South Koreans that the top court ruled in this way? Because it sets a precedent, doesn't it, for other claims?
No, I would not say there's a surprise. In fact, if you were to talk to most members of the South Korean public, there's a very strong opinion here that Japan has not been held fully accountable for what it did during the colonial period. And this extends not only to the issue of forced labor, but also to the much more sensitive issue of comfort women.
So how might it upset South Korean-Japanese relations?
Well, unfortunately, the ties between the two countries have not been all that great, especially after Mr. Moon Jae-in took power as South Korea's new president last year. There are several things that the two countries are certainly having problems over, one not least of which is the comfort women issue that I have mentioned. The government wants to undo the agreement that was signed between the Abe administration and the previous Park Geun-hye, president of South Korea, Park Geun-hye, which was supposed to be final and irreversible. And in fact, the actions are being taken to undo the foundation that has been created with money from the Japanese government to compensate the victims. Another issue, of course, is that of who owns the islets of Dokdo, these disputed rocks in the sea between South Korea and Japan. We have seen the Abe administration certainly coming up very strongly and trying to assert its territorial claim over this particular part of the ocean. And this is something that South Koreans very much take exception to.
Sae-won-koo, thanks very much for filling us in there on that situation between South Korea and Japan. Now, the race is on for the top job in Europe's biggest economy as German Chancellor Angela Merkel announced she will leave politics at the end of her term in 2021. And she's standing down as the head of her centre-right party later this year. Nadine Barber reports from Berlin.
Angela Merkel's message to leaders of her party, the Christian Democrats or the CDU, is clear. It's time to begin a new chapter. On Monday, she announced, to nobody's great surprise, that this would be her last term as Germany's Chancellor. But she also plans to quit as party leader by the end of the year.
I will not put myself forward again as candidate for the CDU chair. Secondly, this fourth term is my last as German Chancellor. At the federal election in 2021, I will not stand again as the Chancellor candidate, nor as a candidate for the Bundestag. And for the sake of protocol, I won't seek any further political offices.
Angela Merkel's been Chancellor for 13 years. Stepping down as leader of her party, a position she's held for nearly 2 decades, means the race will soon be on to find a replacement, allowing a new figure to build a profile ahead of the next election. The announcement came after Merkel's CDU experienced big losses in a regional vote in the western state of Hesse. The party came first and will still be in charge along with the Greens, but it saw an 11% drop in support. It was the second electoral setback in as many weeks for Merkel's Conservative alliance. And nationally, her partners in government, the Social Democrats, have threatened to end what's known as the Grand Coalition if the downward trend continues.
Her party has tolerated her because she was able to negotiate coalitions where they would be the strongest partner. That's been less so since the last elections. The Social Democrats would only join the government if they got the post as foreign minister and finance minister. And many in the party say, well, you sold us too cheaply.
Of course, any period of political uncertainty here in Germany will also be a worry for the European Union at a time when the bloc's dealing with a budget crisis in Italy, Brexit, and not least, rising populism across the continent. That's why they'll be paying close attention to which figure the CDU lines up as Merkel's successor and where the main challenges come from. Nadeem Barber, Al Jazeera, Berlin.
Some of Australia's best-loved animals are losing their homes as trees are being cut down. The koala is in crisis, as Andrew Thomas reports from Port Stephens.
They are one of two animals Australia is known for. But unlike kangaroos, koala numbers are falling fast. Cars kill them, as do dogs and disease. But the central cause, one that lies behind all those threats, is human destruction of the places koalas live, forcing them closer to people and each other.
It all comes back to habitat loss. If a koala has lost habitat, they have to come down, search for habitat, which then makes them have to cross roads, so they're susceptible to being hit by cars and attacked by dogs as well.
North of Sydney, this small rehabilitation centre is about to be transformed into a full koala hospital, costing $2 million. The state government of New South Wales will pay for it, but that's the same government, say campaigners, which is allowing, even encouraging, the destruction of koala habitat.
We are incredibly appreciative that we're getting this hospital. We need this hospital, but the laws that allow the habitat clearing, it's give on one hand and take on the other.
Last year, New South Wales relaxed laws controlling the amount of land farmers can clear of trees. As a result, says a new report, land clearing rates have tripled. Those behind the report say that if current trends continue, koalas could be extinct in the wild in New South Wales by 2050.
It's really shocking, and it's certainly within our power to stop. But if we don't stop habitat destruction, we will be the ones that will see these animals in the wild for the last time.
New South Wales's Environment Minister turned down a request for an interview, but the state government says old land clearing laws were too restrictive. Farming and development does not need to threaten koalas. But this patch of wetland forest north of Sydney illustrates the subjective nature of the decisions. It's owned by the Education Department of the state government, which doesn't need it for a school, so 2 years ago sold it to a developer. After environmentalists started petitions and campaigns, the state government said it had made a mistake and is now trying to buy the land back for more than it was sold.
One part of government doesn't communicate with the other. Before any government department flogs off land, they're supposed to go around to other government departments and ask, do you want it? Nobody asks the Department of Environment, as far as we know, do you want this land?
The more land that disappears, the more animal hospitals will be needed. Andrew Thomas, Al Jazeera, Port Stephens, Australia.
The value of the Mexican peso has suffered its biggest fall for 2 years after the president-elect cancelled construction of a new airport in the capital. Crews were told to go home by Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who says contracts for the multi-billion-dollar project are corrupt. From Mexico City, John Holman reports.
A new space-age airport meant to propel Mexico into the 21st century. Its cost, $13 billion. Its construction well underway. But on Monday, President-elect Andrés Manuel López Obrador brought it to a juddering halt. The project was riddled with corruption and cronyism, he said. Instead, other airports will have their capacities increased.
Two runways will be built in the Santa Lucia Military Airport. The current airport in Mexico City will be improved, and the Toluca Airport will be reactivated.
But the decision was about more than just the airport or the markets. For many, it was an early sign of how the president-elect plans to govern. He said he'd let the people choose the way ahead via a national referendum. But when it was finished this Sunday, it was widely panned. Just 1% of the electorate turned out.
The questions were flawed, skewed in favor of the option that the new government wants. It was shown that voters could vote more than once in the different polling stations. I mean, hardly you can see this as a successful exercise of participative democracy.
López Obrador plans to change the constitution for more referendums on key issues. But that's not the sort of decision-making that will tempt future investors, say business leaders.
We hope that the incoming government make the rules of the game clearer, so that long-term projects don't suffer from the repercussions and mistrust of the Mexican government.
At the stock exchange, those repercussions were already being felt. The drop in the peso is a real reflection of the deep concerns of the markets and the business community. But the president-elect says that he's not governing for them, he's governing for the people, and first and foremost, the poor. He says the airport project's cancellation will save the country $5 billion a year, and his alternative plan will be finished in 3 years. By that time, Mexicans will also have a clearer idea of who they voted into power. John Holman, Al Jazeera, Mexico City.
Now, with Al Jazeera, these are our top stories. Turkey's president says a game is being played over the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi to protect someone. Recep Tayyip Erdogan's comments come as Saudi Arabia's top prosecutor met Turkish officials for a second time. And sources tell Al Jazeera that he handed over the testimonies of 18 suspects. The Saudi side had refused to do so in a first round of talks on Monday. There are, however, still disagreements over where the suspects should be tried. Ousted Sri Lankan Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe has addressed protesters outside the official residence he's refusing to leave. His supporters are demanding Parliament be reconvened. President Maithripala Sirisena replaced Wickremesinghe with former President Mahinda Rajapaksa and suspended Parliament for 2 weeks so that he can gain support. After a meeting in Bangladesh, the Myanmar government has agreed to begin repatriating Rohingya refugees by the middle of next month. Rights groups say their return to Rakhine State must be voluntary and dignified. Around 750,000 fled the military crackdown last year. In Tunisia, at least 20 people have been wounded after a suicide bomber blew herself up in the capital, Tunis. 15 policemen are amongst the injured. The country has been under a state of emergency since 2015, when dozens of people were killed in a series of ISIL attacks.
I regret to say that security personnel are always paying the heavy toll, paying it in blood. I am sure officials will identify the causes and consequences. Such attacks undermine the state, its authority and stature. I believe any gathering must be licensed, as it is a right guaranteed by the Constitution. We thought we had driven tourism out of our cities into the caves, yet it is now in the heart of the capital city.
And a Japanese steel company has been ordered to compensate 4 South Koreans for their forced labour during World War II. South Korea's Supreme Court ruled that Nippon Steel must pay each plaintiff $87,000. The company has called the ruling regrettable. Japan occupied South Korea from 1910 to 1945 and is accused of never fully apologising or paying repatriations to South Koreans. Those are your headlines. Inside Story is next. Stay with us.
Another mass shooting in the United States, 11 dead in a Pittsburgh synagogue. How worrying is the rise of right-wing extremism in America? Who's to blame? And does President Donald Trump's rhetoric fuel the hate? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Imran Khan. The number of reported hate crimes in the United States rose in 2016, the year Donald Trump was elected president. The second consecutive year, the figures have increased. African Americans, Jews and Muslims were all targeted. Last week, a Florida man was arrested after mail bombs were sent to some of Trump's high-profile critics. And on Saturday, 11 people were killed in a synagogue in Pittsburgh. Shihab Ratansi reports on the latest mass shooting.
A message of defiance and of the need to address the causes of right-wing extremist violence was heard at a multi-faith vigil in Pittsburgh early Sunday evening.
We will recognize this moment as a moment when this nation needs to heal, and the nation needs to come together under the common sense of how we stop events like this from happening ever again.
Rabbi Jonathan Perlman was there as the shots rang out and attempted to help congregants to safety.
What happened will not break us. It will not ruin us. We will continue to thrive and sing and worship and learn together and continue our historic legacy in this city with the friendliest people that we know.
As police and SWAT teams responded, it soon became apparent that this was a hate crime. The suspected gunman, Robert Bowers, told police he wanted to kill as many Jews as possible. Armed with an assault rifle and pistols, Bowers killed 8 men and 3 women. Their ages ranged from 54 to 97, a married couple and 2 brothers among the dead.
During the course of his deadly assault on the people of the synagogue, Bowers made statements regarding genocide and his desire to kill Jewish people. After a standoff with police, Bowers eventually surrendered and remains in federal custody today. So our complaint charges Bowers with 29 separate federal crimes.
Outside the Tree of Life synagogue, people have been laying flowers for the victims all day. This is one of the oldest Jewish communities in the U.S.
There must be no tolerance for anti-Semitism in America or for any form of religious or racial hatred or prejudice.
Shortly after the shooting, President Trump calling for unity in a nation where hate crime is on the rise. But in fact, as investigators search Bowers' home for evidence, there's now renewed focus on the rhetoric the president himself uses. Bowers appears to have been triggered by a white extremist conspiracy theory about U.S. Jews funding the caravan of Central American migrants making its way through Mexico, a theme President Trump himself has alluded to. The president and his supporters, however, disavowing any linkages. Donald Trump instead musing that perhaps an armed guard may have prevented this massacre. Shia Britansi, Al Jazeera, Pittsburgh.
Before we go to our guest, let's remind ourselves of some of the other attacks. One woman died in Charlottesville, Virginia, when a car plowed into a crowd during rival protests by white supremacists and anti-racists. Mosques became a target. One in Michigan was burned down, another in Arizona broken into, and a homemade bomb was detonated at an Islamic center in Minnesota. African Americans were attacked by whites. A university student in Maryland was stabbed to death, and a 66-year-old man in Baltimore was killed with a sword. Immigrants were also victims. A white man was kicked out of a bar in Kansas City after racially abusing 2 Indian men. He returned and shot them, killing one. Let's now bring in our guests. Joining us in Nutley, New Jersey, we have Stephen Rogers. He's a member of the Trump for President Advisory Board and a former member of the FBI National Joint Terrorism Task Force. In New York, Stosh Kotler, CEO of Bend the Arc, that's a Jewish action group. And in Boston, Glenn Carl, former Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Transnational Threats at the CIA. A warm welcome to you all. I'd like to start in New York with Stosh Kotler. You've written this open letter asking the US President Donald Trump to denounce white nationalism. You're very convinced that it's because of his rhetoric that's allowed the Pittsburgh attack to happen. Why do you think that?
I absolutely believe that this president and his administration and all of those who enable him have created an environment where so many of us are in danger. Jews are in danger, Muslim communities are in danger, Sikh communities, immigrant communities, people of color communities, trans communities, all of us have been named explicitly and implicitly in the rhetoric, in the campaign rallies that have been held. We have been made to be known to the rest of this country as dangers, as menaces, which we all know is not true. And what we also know is that when language and the vitriol and when the tone is so, when it is so elevated, we can be certain that someone will take that tone as permission to create and cause violence. What happened this weekend, and actually what happened with the murders of the 2 Black people in Kentucky this week, all of these are examples of what is inevitable when we have a president and when we have an entire Republican Party who refuses to denounce white nationalism, who refuses to renounce white supremacy, and who create the conditions where people feel like they can act without repercussions. Our communities are being terrorized, and this president needs to be held accountable.
But this is a very strong letter. Some could perhaps accuse you by saying that President Donald Trump is not welcome in Pittsburgh of amping up the rhetoric and using the same type of language as you're accusing the US president of.
Well, I would frame it differently. The letter says very clearly that Trump and members of his cabinet and this administration would, in fact, be welcome in Pittsburgh and everywhere else, with the simple request that he and all members of the Republican Party denounce white nationalism. That should be quite straightforward. White nationalists are extremists. White nationalists have been known to be called and are domestic terrorists. There's absolutely no reason why the President of the United States and the Republican Party and its members should not have the common decency and the moral compass to simply say that white nationalism is not acceptable in the United States.
Let me bring in Stephen Rogers in New Jersey here. You've heard what our guest has had to say. US President Donald Trump is responsible for the rhetoric that's fueled the kind of hatred we've seen over the weekend. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely not. Look, the President of the United States and the Republican Party and the Democrat Party and every decent living human being on this earth has denounced white nationalism, bias, and prejudice on the face of this earth. That's number one. Number two, look, I've been in law enforcement for 38 years, and I've learned one thing, that those who commit acts of violence and crime, they're the ones accountable and responsible for their actions. We have gone through decades of violence on television, violence on radio, violence in the newspapers. We've been fed in this country decades of violence from Hollywood. I mean, look, we have a culture that has been growing up for years on violence. So it is unfair and unwarranted to blame this on the rhetoric of the President of the United States. And let me add this, that the Jewish communities throughout this country do support the President. The Prime Minister of Israel supports the President. So at the end of the day, this is not to be pinned on the President and his rhetoric, or anybody else's rhetoric for that matter. The people who committed these crimes, these acts of violence, are responsible for that. But the healing, we have to begin, and I agree at this point, we have to begin to think about healing, and it's going to be, it must begin in our elementary schools. We must talk more and teach more about anti-Semitism and prejudice. We haven't been doing much of that, and we should focus our attention on that.
Like you say, you've been in law enforcement for 38 years. You are saying that there is a culture of violence in the US, but nothing happens in a vacuum. What we're asking you is the reason the Pittsburgh shooting happened is because the shooter felt enabled by a rise in white nationalism in the US, because he felt that the US president, certain members of his administration, have been sympathetic or at least understanding of white nationalists, if not outwardly supporting them.
Well, look, I can't get into this individual's mind. I mean, there have been criminals who I have interviewed over the years who have said that they have certain beliefs, certain theology that they believe in, but never have I heard anyone say, well, I blame it on one particular person, one particular actress or actor or president or politician. I think that's kind of using that person, in this case, the president, as a scapegoat. Look, that we have people all over this country. Look at the actors and even some of the sports figures calling out for violence. Eric Holder, Maxine Waters, calling out for people to commit violent acts against Republicans. I don't think they're responsible for some lunatic walking into a restaurant doing what they did a few weeks ago to Mitch McConnell and others. So accountability and responsibility is on the shoulders of those who committed the crimes.
Let me bring in Boston here, and Glenn Carl. You heard there that it was an individual lunatic, to use Stephen Rogers' term there. However, how much of this has to do with being able to operate much more openly now, being able to say that I am a white nationalist and therefore these are my beliefs? Do you think things have changed for the worse in the United States of America?
Oh, I don't think so. I know so. It's not a question of my opinion or even an informal assessment. There's empirical data that demonstrates that this is the case. For years, the intelligence community has assessed formally, that includes the FBI, the CIA, all of the law enforcement, that the greatest danger to American lives and treasure in the United States comes from the far-right militia and vigilante groups. Unfortunately, or tragically, terribly, the intelligence community was not really allowed to say that clearly because, according to the Republican leadership who denied us the authorization to state that, that would then tar, quote, unfairly, the conservatives, who are the Republicans. But the data is clear. Also, just as when in sports, your body goes where you turn your head, similarly, our thoughts go where our words lead us. Words have practical, physical, material, demonstrable effect. And to allege that statements that create a false equivalence between white nationalists, let's call them what they are, racists and American fascists, with people who oppose that is either disingenuous or naive. It's a fact.
Let me bring in New York here and Stosh Kotler. You've just heard what both our guests have to say. The Anti-Defamation League are reporting that a rise in hate crimes has gone up by has gone to 57%, a big spark since the US President Donald Trump took over. What's the language that the US President uses that worries you the most? Before the Pittsburgh attack happened, were you alarmed by the kind of things that he was saying?
Yes, I've been alarmed by this president from the moment he took office and, in fact, when he started his candidacy. And I just want to double down on the words of the speaker who just spoke before me. I really want to make sure that it is very clear that the Jewish community, 76% of the Jewish community did not vote for Donald Trump. 30% of the Jewish community only identify as Republicans. We are overwhelmingly a community that does not support this agenda, this administration's agenda, and the language, the rhetoric, the rallies, the incitement to mob violence, the scapegoating, this is creating a sense of permission for the individuals who do follow Trump and this administration to act brazenly and to act as if they are not going to have consequences. And because of that, I think it is imperative that all of us around the country, all of us who feel like we are in the crosshairs right now of a dangerous administration who is not interested in caring for our lives, the lives of our families or communities, in honor of those who were slain in Pittsburgh, in honor of those who are calling for Donald Trump to either renounce white nationalism and his party, the Republicans, to denounce white nationalism, or they are not welcome in Pittsburgh. I believe it's time that all of us across the country hold up that call as well, that all communities who feel like we are targets of Trump make it clear that neither he or anyone in the Republican Party is welcome in our towns, in our cities, in our states, unless they do the simple, basic, right thing, which is to denounce white nationalism, to make it clear that that is a party that does not want ties to these radical extremists. But really, these ideas are not only held any longer by extremists. These are ideas that have become mainstream, part of the Republican Party's platform overall, and it needs to stop.
Stephen Rogers in New Jersey, is it time for the US president to denounce white nationalism?
He has. He has denounced white nationalism, and so has the Republican Party. And let me add this. One of our guests used the word mob. Well, that word mob didn't come out of the president's mouth. That came out of the mouth of some of the Democrats. That was Maxine Waters and that was Eric Holder. They were the ones that said, let's get the mobs after the Republican leadership in the restaurants. So you see, that my point is that, look, we could point the finger in the direction of the president or in the direction of the Democrats. It's the person who commits the act of violence. Yeah, we can do better. We could work well together. But what we must do is recognize the root cause of this problem has been going on for decades and decades and decades. And we still have massive violence in Chicago, massive violence in Baltimore. That has nothing to do with the rhetoric that's going on. My point is, together, we could work very well together if we start elementary school level, start refocusing on the things that we need to focus on to stop violence. And may I add one more thing? It also begins in the home. We've got to get parents engaged with their children about all of these things that are going on. This was a tragedy. Of all tragedies I've had in my lifetime, this is the worst one. And it should be a wake-up call to everyone. But let's point in the direction that we should to start healing these wounds.
Glenn Carl in Boston. Our guest in New Jersey, Stephen Rogers, is saying that it needs to begin at home, that perhaps Hollywood is to blame for all of this, that there's a culture of violence in the US that's perhaps to blame for all of this. Is it also to do with the fact that the US has some of the most lax gun control laws in the world? Is gun control a part of this as well, the ease of availability of weapons?
Well, what we just heard are sort of the tired old shell game rationalizations when the facts are pretty clear. The statement that guns don't kill people, people kill people is part of this whole silly trope, or tragic trope. What are guns intended to do? They are designed to kill people. If people didn't have guns, would guns kill people? The answer is no. There's a clear, again, empirically demonstrable, overwhelmingly proven relationship between the availability of guns and the number of people who are killed by them. In Europe, dozens of people per year are killed by handguns in a population that's larger than the United States. In the United States, it's 12,000 per year. What is the one difference between the two civilizations or societies? It's the availability of guns. So this business that it's because of video games or violence being condoned or not taught against in the home is dissembling. The simple word for it is that it is a lie. Again, either it is naive because it's sincerely believed but wrong, or it is misleading. The facts are clear. Guns lead to death, and gun control will reduce it. That's just empirically demonstrated.
Stosh Kotler in New York. This was very much about racism, about anti-Semitism, but your concerns are slightly larger than that in that you feel that minority communities are being targeted under this administration. I'm going to ask you about the gun control laws. Do you think that would have helped, or do you think the hatred would simply manifest itself in a different way?
Well, I believe that we absolutely are a country that needs to have an entire transformation on how we are approaching the issues of gun violence and gun control. I absolutely agree we need to have a very different and aggressive set of reforms that, in fact, most gun owners, most members of the NRA, most folks who actually use guns for things like hunting and to provide food for their family, they too also want for there to be common sense solutions so that people aren't using guns to murder and accidentally cause deaths. I do believe as well that the slaughter of 11 people on Saturday morning during a prayer service when a baby was being named, that did happen at the hands of an individual who was wielding a gun. And I also do believe that the hatred and the bigotry and the ability to dehumanize an entire community of people, entire communities of people, mean that there will be individuals who are given a platform by our leader in this country, the President of the United States, who calls them fine people, that these individuals will find ways to harm and injure and kill others of us who this president, the Republican Party, and many others have deemed to be people who don't matter, people whose lives are not worth saving or caring about. So yes, it's true. I do very much believe that we need to have a very different set of gun reforms in this country, and there are fantastic organizations that are doing that work. I do want us to keep a focus on the fact that this violence happened because we have, as a country, created an environment where certain communities are deemed to be more disposable and dispensable than others. And for all of us who are in the crosshairs of this administration who is too cowardly in this moment to simply denounce white nationalism right now, today, let's have everyone just say white nationalism is not acceptable in the United States. We will not do business with white nationalists.
We are running out of time.
We will not
I'm going
sit
to
on boards of white
ask
nationalists.
Stephen Rogers here in New Jersey to come in there because we are running out of time and I do want to get to you all again. Stephen Rogers, there's two questions I really want to ask you here. Gun control, do you need more gun control? Would a good guy with a gun have been able to stop that attack in Pittsburgh? And secondly, why doesn't the president denounce white nationalism in clear terms in the wake of the Pittsburgh attack?
Okay, once again, I must tell you that he has denounced white nationalism, as has the Republican Party. He's done that a few times, so that's already been done. And if he needs to do it again, and I believe he does, I'm sure he's going to do it again. But with regard to gun control, yes, the prior speaker's right. There should be common sense gun regulations or some sort of guidelines that could keep guns away from mentally deranged people. But let me say this. Chicago has the toughest gun control laws in the nation, the highest murder rate by guns. Baltimore, high murder rate by guns. Washington, D.C., one of the toughest, higher murder rate by guns. The fact of the matter is, and look, I've been involved in a shooting. I've seen victims who have been on the other end of a gun barrel. And had they had a gun in their hands, maybe some of them would be alive. Responsible gun owners with guns, as we've seen this past week, by the way, will put an end to these people who are coming in and at the very least minimize more violence. If a person did have a weapon in the synagogue, well, who knows what would have happened?
I just need to bring it in. We are running out of time. We are running out of time. But let me just bring in Boston here and Glenn Carl. I saw you shaking your head at what Stephen Rogers was saying. Why are you shaking your head?
Well, this is another empirically proven mistruth, false statement. All of the data shows that the possession of guns, actually by people who think that it will lead to their help for self-defense, leads to increased danger of them being harmed by somebody else with a gun or violence. It does not make one safer. It puts one in greater danger. That's simply empirically proven.
Thanks to all our guests, Stephen Rogers, Glenn Carl and Stosh Kotler. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Imran Khan, and the whole team here, bye for now.
History is so often told through the eyes of leaders. But in Amritsar, India, just 30 kilometers from the border with Pakistan, this old building is being transformed into a new museum. Malika Aluwalia is the driving force behind Amritsar's Partition Museum.
It's really shocking because if you think about the fact that within a few years of 9/11 happening, a 9/11 museum was there, and there are now numerous Holocaust museums. There's a beautiful apartheid museum. So countries around the world have worked to memorialize these events that have shaped them. Partition is not about the political events that led up to partition. It's about the impact on each person who went through it. It's really important that we highlight the stories of humanity. Hopefully one outcome of this would be that we remember our shared humanity and the shared history.
Divorce rates in Taiwan are soaring, and as a marriage consultant, Helen knows this only too well. But as their 60th wedding anniversary approaches, her own parents are locking horns rather than arms. Can her daughterly love and professional expertise make them see eye to eye? My Father, My Mother. Part of the Viewfinder Asia series on Al Jazeera.
The latest news as it breaks.
The Saudis' narrative contradicts the information that Turkish officials have been giving for the past 2 weeks.
With detailed coverage.
This whole flat area of mud was shops and houses, and it was completely washed away, along with the people who were inside.
From around the world.
The government doesn't call this a detention center, but it's surrounded by barbed wire fences, and its exits are manned by armed guards.
80% of the visually impaired could be cured with access to treatment. And where there is a will, there is a way. a flying, state-of-the-art hospital. Wow. Covering over 77 countries.
How many of these patients will be seen today?
Everywhere. And in Pakistan, one man's passion provides free treatment for over 1 million patients a year. The Cure Revisited on Al Jazeera.
You're watching Al Jazeera. I'm Sahil Rahman in Doha. These are our top stories. Turkey's president says a game is being played over the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi to protect someone. Recep Tayyip Erdogan's comments come as Saudi Arabia's top prosecutor met Turkish officials for a second time. And sources tell Al Jazeera that he handed over the testimonies of 18 suspects. The Saudi side has refused to do so in the first round of talks on Monday. There are still disagreements over where the suspects should be tried. Alan Fisher has more from Istanbul.
So where are we between Saudi Arabia and Turkish cooperation? Well, when they met on Monday, the Saudis said that they wanted all audio and video recordings that the Turks allegedly have from inside the building at the time Jamal Khashoggi was killed. The Turks turned that down. They said that they were still putting together an indictment against the people that they believe were responsible. Also, that crosses in to the idea of revealing how Turkey got that information, gets into intelligence gathering, not something that I'm sure they want to show to the Saudis. In return, they said that they wanted the statements of these 18 people currently being held in Saudi Arabia. Initially, Saudi Arabia said no, but when the chief prosecutor went back on Tuesday, obviously after consulting with senior figures in the government in Riyadh overnight, he then handed over those documents. Now, those statements are all in Arabic. There is a stipulation that they won't be released to the public, but they will have to be translated from Arabic into Turkish, and that may well give the prosecutor a much clearer idea of what happened inside the building. But the outstanding question still remains for Saudi Arabia, and this is being posed both internationally and also here in Turkey itself. What happened to the body of Jamal Khashoggi? Who was this Turkish person who was given the task of disposing the body? What did they do with it? Are we talking about a whole body? Are we talking about body parts? And so Saudi Arabia is coming under pressure to make that clear, not just to the Turkish authorities, but to the family of Jamal Khashoggi.
Sri Lanka's ousted Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe has spoken to protesters who've gathered outside his residence. He's been refusing to leave since the president decided to replace him. Bernard Smith has this update.
The end of the street behind me is where ousted Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe has been holed up. It's the official Prime Minister's residence, and he's been refusing to leave. This is what is ending now as a very large protest. Many thousands of people here in Colombo protesting outside that residence. When Wickremesinghe, ousted Prime Minister, came out to speak to them, they want Parliament to be reconvened. What's happened is that Wickremesinghe has been fired by Sri Lanka's President Sirisena and replaced by former President Mahinda Rajapaksa. Now, everybody here says that is unconstitutional because Sri Lanka's constitution has been changed. It gives power to Parliament, takes power away from the President, and the Prime Minister, who has a parliamentary majority, is the one who should be anointed, made Prime Minister. The protesters say the President's ignored that, and he's also suspended Parliament. The suspicion being that while Parliament remains suspended, the appointed Prime Minister, Rajapaksa, can gather support and get enough people on his side to show that he has a parliamentary majority. But everybody here very uncomfortable, very unhappy about that. Wickremesinghe has called his people out on the streets to protest and to protect democracy, he says, because he is the legal Prime Minister.
Bangladesh and Myanmar have agreed to begin returning Rohingya refugees by the middle of next month. 15 Myanmar government delegates are in the Bangladeshi capital Dhaka. Around 750,000 Rohingya fled the military crackdown in Rakhine State last year. Rights groups say their return must be voluntary and dignified. A Japanese steel company has been ordered to compensate 4 South Koreans for their forced labour during World War II. South Korea's Supreme Court ruled that Nippon Steel must pay each plaintiff $87,000. The company has called the ruling regrettable. Japan occupied South Korea from 1910 to 1945 and is accused of never fully apologising or paying reparations to South Koreans who are forced to work without pay. Those were the headlines. And back with more news in half an hour. We continue with Al Jazeera correspondent.
I'm James Gannon, a news editor for Al Jazeera. I grew up in this house in Virginia in the southern United States. My childhood here was a happy one. My family weren't rich, but we were comfortable. I was particularly close to my grandmother, Mary Hamilton Lee. It was she that told me about my Lee family history. My most famous ancestor, General Robert E. Lee, led the Confederate Army against the Union during the American Civil War in the mid-19th century. I was proud that this man, considered one of Virginia's greatest heroes, was a relative. I wasn't told that he fought to defend slavery. On the 12th of August, 2017, these pictures of racial hatred in Charlottesville in Virginia were particularly shocking. The cause that white supremacists were rallying around was the preservation of a statue of my ancestor, Robert E. Lee. I felt outraged that my family name was associated with the KKK and neo-Nazis. What happened in Charlottesville made me consider for the first time the true legacy of my slave-owning ancestors. I want to know why people in my home state of Virginia are so divided on the subject of Confederate monuments and what they represent. And I want to find out how much the oppression of enslaved people by my ancestors has had an impact on black lives in America today. What I'm told will at times make me deeply uncomfortable. But these conversations for me are long overdue.
Black Power, bro. Black Power, brother. Already. What's up?
Richmond, Virginia is the former capital of the Confederacy, the 11 southern states that fought the Union in the American Civil War. The statue of my ancestor, Robert E. Lee, is one of 5 Confederate statues on Monument Avenue, the grandest street in Richmond. It stands 18 meters tall and dominates the city's landscape. For over 100 years, Richmond has honored Lee as one of its greatest heroes, until recently. In 2015, 9 black churchgoers in South Carolina were shot by a white supremacist. The killer was photographed with a Confederate flag, a symbol for racists of white supremacy. Soon after, the City Council in New Orleans voted for their Confederate statues to be removed. The state of Louisiana was once a major center for the slave trade. Public consultations took place in Virginia, which once had the largest enslaved population in America. In Richmond, the debate over the Monument Avenue statues was heated.
Now is the time for us to tear down participation trophies for the losing side of a war. You lost. Get over it already. Down with white supremacy.
Let's remember, too, that after the war, Lee did all he could to help reconcile and rebuild relationships between North and South. How can anyone say this great leader is a symbol of hate and evil and white supremacy?
The second question, what additional statues would you like to see? Well, none. Monument Avenue is a Confederate memorial in and of itself. And I do not want to see any monuments on there for any of them low-down invading, murdering, raping, looting, burning heathens from the north.
I want to know why opinions in Richmond are so deeply divided.
Martha? Hey, how are you? Glad to see you.
You too. Martha Rollins is also a cousin of Robert E. Lee.
You know that you look like a Lee.
Do I?
Yeah.
I know we're going to put him on a horse, and then we'll really know.
Yeah.
On a pedestal. Right on a pedestal.
Martha helps run the Richmond chapter of an organization named Coming to the Table. It was set up to help realize one of the dreams of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., that the children of former slaves and slave owners would one day sit down together at the same table.
Just the action of bringing two people together that don't go to the same church, that don't shop in the same place, and don't live in the same neighborhood, and don't look alike. I say that when we even go out in public, we are the marching pair here. We've been on every civil rights and women's march there is. Even just seeing us together models what is possible. That in itself, I know some people say that's really small, but I think it's huge.
It is. Coming to the table, which is to heal the wounds of the legacy of enslavement, really is our ultimate vision and goal and purpose. First leg is uncovering and teaching truth in history.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm gonna give you a lot of homework.
Yes.
This is Monument Avenue.
Martha wastes no time in starting her first lesson on the true history of the American Civil War.
The next one we're coming to is Jefferson Davis. So Jefferson Davis was the president of the Confederacy. Well, you need to read what's written on his monument. It's appalling.
The words on this statue, paid for by the Daughters of the Confederacy, gives a now discredited view of history.